El director de l'Institut d'Estudis d'Autogovern, senyor Jordi Jària Manzano, editor de la revista d'Estudis Autonòmics i Federals. Benvinguts i benvingudes, senyores, amigues i amics. Primer que res, dir-los que per Tarragona acollir aquest seminari organitzat per l'Institut d'Estudis d'Autogovern és un plaer i celebrem que per primera vegada una d'aquestes jornades es porti a terme fora de la capital del país i que sigui, evidentment, a casa nostra. Sens dubte, el motiu que ens aplega, les polítiques per fer front al canvi climàtic, és el repte més gran que com a societat tenim en aquest vertiginós segle XXI. Vivim uns moments de canvis molt ràpids i molt profunds entre un sistema productiu esgotat i un sistema productiu nou, del qual no sabem encara ni podem predir les conseqüències econòmiques i socials que se'n puguin derivar. La governança en l'àmbit estatal, les normatives legislatives a diferents nivells i, sobretot, els recursos que es posin a disposició de la ciutadania seran claus a l'hora de fer que les polítiques mediambientals aterrin i els calendaris d'implantació de les mesures es puguin complir. Ara mateix, la sostenibilitat no és una opció. És una obligació ètica en un marc d'emergència climàtica que tenim com a ciutat i també com a conjunt de la societat. Ja no hi ha volta enrere. El medi ambient ha fet una crida i hem d'estar alerta. Tanmateix, és imprescindible que les ciutats comptem amb la complicitat i les ajudes dels governs per poder avançar en la lluita contra el canvi climàtic. Al govern de Tarragona estem absolutament implicats amb la lluita. De fet, els dos paràmetres que inspiren la nostra actuació són la cohesió social i la sostenibilitat. La descarbonització dels nostres carrers, amb la creació d'una xarxa de carrils bici que uneixin tots els punts de la ciutat, és una de les nostres actuacions més emblemàtiques. A tot això cal sumar-hi que vàrem ser ciutat 30 km/h abans que moltes altres, tenint clar que l'objectiu és situar les persones al centre de la planificació urbana i aconseguir una mobilitat urbana sostenible, més segura i més saludable. Estem renovant la flota d'autobusos, ja hem comprat 3 vehicles propulsats amb hidrogen verd i en poc temps tindrem mitja flota amb aquest combustible. Estem implicats en la generació d'hidrogen verd des de les empreses municipals d'aigua, de transports i la mancomunitat de residus. Val a dir que algunes empreses privades ja han iniciat els tràmits per instal·lar hidrogeneres als nostres polígons industrials. I hem començat també la instal·lació de calderes de biomassa a diferents equipaments municipals, esportius i escolars, treballant en la gestió dels boscos sense oblidar-nos de la perspectiva de prevenció dels incendis en la que hem fet importants intervencions. Ens ocupem dels nostres rius i del litoral, amb problemes crònics a les conques fluvials, especialment aguts els darrers anys a les nostres platges, deguts als temporals que cada cop més destructius. Una part significativa dels fons Next Generation que hem aconseguit estan adreçats a la preservació i regeneració dels espais naturals i esperem que algun altre Next Generation important, com el vinculat al turisme sostenible, se'ns acabi concedint. Són també rellevants les mesures d'estímul als particulars. En aquest sentit, implementem polítiques fiscals que aposten per la sostenibilitat, com la bonificació del 50% de la quota íntegra de l'IBI per a aquells ciutadans que instal·lin plaques solars. I recentment hem aconseguit més de 8 milions d'euros, la tercera ciutat catalana en quantitat assolida, per acompanyar les comunitats de propietaris en les reformes per millorar l'eficiència energètica. Som plenament conscients de la nostra responsabilitat com a municipi. L'administració més propera al ciutadà i potser la que més pot influir a generar efectes positius a l'activitat quotidiana. Però necessitem legislacions clares i estímuls efectius. Per això, valorem molt el resultat d'aquestes jornades de legislació comparada. No voldria acabar sense alçar una mica el focus i assenyalar la importància de la perspectiva mediambiental en el disseny de la ciutat. A Tarragona estem treballant en un nou POU, un Plan d'Ordenació Urbana Municipal, i volem implementar les línies directives de les estratègies de ciutat del govern municipal, recosint Tarragona per acabar amb els enormes espais buits que generen cicatrius culturals i socials, apostant per la rehabilitació urbana i evitant el creixement en extensió que delmi els nostres espais amb més valor natural i paisatgístic. Necessitem més espais verds i menys asfalt. Considerem la ciutat com un actor important en la lluita contra l'emergència climàtica. Permetin-me acabar exercint la meva tasca d'alcalde anfitrió. Vostè sap que estem celebrant la nostra festa major, una festa que enguany celebra 700 anys. De fet, 701 des que va arribar la relíquia de la Praça de Santa Tecla. Unes festes vibrants, participades i creatives. Els convido a fruir de les festes i de la ciutat. Un cop acabin aquestes jornades, jo us aconsello fer-hi una immersió d'uns quants dies. Us asseguro que no oblidaran l'experiència. Els desitjo un bon i productiu seminari. Moltes gràcies.
Bé, bona tarda a totes i a tots. M'agradaria començar, com feia l'alcalde, amb un petit capítol protocolari, però no per això menys sincer, agraint en primer lloc a la Universitat Rovira i Virgili el fet d'haver hostatjat tant aquest congrés com aquest side event, aquesta jornada o aquest seminari que celebrarem aquesta tarda al voltant de les polítiques comparades a nivell regional europeu sobre medi ambient. Bé, segurament molts de vostès és la primera vegada que estan a Tarragona, altres no, però segurament molts és la primera vegada que estan en aquesta Facultat de Ciències Jurídiques de la Universitat Rovira i Virgili. I en aquest sentit vull recordar que aquesta ha estat una facultat i, de fet, la universitat, en el seu conjunt, pionera en el conjunt de l'Estat en una qüestió com l'estudi, la docència, la recerca i també, per què no, la col·laboració amb diferents instàncies públiques, privades, entitats que treballen en l'àmbit del medi ambient. I, de fet, té una llarga tradició perquè des que es va fundar aquesta Facultat de Ciències Jurídiques, diré que primers dels anys 90, doncs aquesta facultat ja es va distingir per aquesta singularitat i així és coneguda a Catalunya, però també arreu de l'Estat i també en termes europeus. Precisament en el si d'aquesta Facultat de Ciències Jurídiques i tenint en compte aquesta inquietud o aquesta preocupació per les qüestions que tenen a veure amb el medi ambient, va veure néixer una entitat, un centre de recerca, que és el que avui, en definitiva, organitza aquest congrés i també aquest event, que és el CEDAT, el Centre d'Estudis de Dret Ambiental. Aquí, òbviament, vull agrair la seva estreta i generosa col·laboració amb l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern del Govern de la Generalitat de Catalunya, que segurament, com vostès saben, és un organisme que estudia essencialment totes les qüestions que tenen a veure amb l'organització territorial del poder polític en el marc dels estats complexos, descentralitzats, i per tant, des d'aquest punt de vista era molt interessant aquest marc de col·laboració per poder organitzar aquest seminari. En segon lloc, òbviament, vull agrair també a l'alcalde de Tarragona, l'amic Pau Ricomà, il·lustríssim senyor Pau Ricomà, qui fa anys que conec, no només per la seva predisposició a participar en aquest acte, sinó especialment perquè, com ell molt bé acaba d'explicar, ja fa alguns dies que la ciutat de Tarragona està immersa en les seves festes de Santa Tecla i, per tant, segur que ha estat complicat, em consta, haver trobat un forat en la seva atapeïda agenda per poder-nos acompanyar i, de fet, ens honora amb la seva presència, però també vull recordar que hi ha un vincle especial entre aquest Ajuntament de Tarragona i el seu mateix alcalde amb el mateix CEDAT, que organitza aquest esdeveniment, en la mesura que un dels instruments fonamentals d'aquest sedat és la càtedra d'Estudis de Dret Ambiental de Tarragona, que porta el nom d'un dels seus antecessors, l'alcalde Pere Lloret, que va ser alcalde durant la Segona República, que va ser depurat, que va ser exilat i que durant molts anys va exercir una funció de responsable d'administracions locals al govern de la Generalitat durant l'etapa republicana, però que malauradament mai no va poder tornar a ocupar les seves ocupacions. Bé, en qualsevol cas, aquest fet, la presència del mateix alcalde Ricomà, posa en relleu el fet que la ciutat de Tarragona, amb centres de recerca com el que acabo d'esmentar, com el sedat, que patrocina i que organitza aquest acte, però també per unes característiques que el propi alcalde ja ha glosat breument, de caràcter social, econòmic, la proximitat amb un entorn metropolità, la petroquímica, l'entorn paisatgístic, el litoral, les platges, el turisme, etc., fa que reuneixi unes característiques, podríem dir, molt singulars des del punt de vista social i econòmic i que, per tant, la fan ideal per dur a terme un debat sobre el canvi climàtic i en el dia d'avui a partir d'una qüestió més, si vostès volen, més micro, com la descentralització de les polítiques mediambientals. Prova d'aquesta singularitat de la ciutat de Tarragona és que la European Environmental Law Forum, que com vostès saben és una entitat sense afany de lucre que aplega acadèmics i professors de dret ambiental i que té, en definitiva, com a gran objectiu, com a motor de la seva actuació, fomentar l'intercanvi d'idees entorn al desenvolupament i la implementació del dret ambiental arreu, va apostar per el sedat i va apostar també per la ciutat de Tarragona per poder, en definitiva, albergar aquest congrés anual. En segon lloc, sobre l'oportunitat del congrés, poca cosa hi puc afegir. No soc expert en dret ambiental, no és un àmbit de la meva disciplina, però sí tinc una perspectiva com la que poden tenir vostès com a experts, però també com a ciutadà. Des d'una perspectiva purament empírica, malgrat algunes tentacions negacionistes gairebé tan hilarants com les terraplanistes, hem pogut assistir aquests últims mesos i en particular aquest estiu a registres històrics pel que fa a les temperatures. Hem vist ara al final de l'estiu pluges torrencials, hem assistit també a grans incendis autènticament devastadors que, en definitiva, ja van ser alertats i advertits ja fa molts anys pel segon grup de treball del grup intergovernamental d'experts sobre el canvi climàtic, en el sentit d'alertar o advertir contra l'alteració antròpica de la mà de l'home del medi ambient i assistim, a més, a una acceleració segurament imprevista i de conseqüències, en molts casos, fins i tot catastròfica. I, per tant, en suma, podríem dir que assistim a la manifestació més remarcable, més destacable per la seva intensitat i també per la seva perillositat de l'alteració per part de l'acció humana de la biosfera i a una acceleració, insisteixo, de manera excepcional en els darrers temps. Bé, tota aquesta constatació des del punt de vista no només empíric i científic em porta a dir que, òbviament, des del món del dret és molt important que hi hagi un empeny continuat i sostingut entorn a proposar accions de caràcter legislatiu, dissenyar polítiques públiques, auxiliar el conjunt d'agents que intervenen sobretot des de l'àmbit o des de l'esfera de lo públic en el terreny del medi ambient, és a dir, en el sentit de fer contínuament propostes de revisió de la governança i, per tant, iniciatives, insisteixo, que no poden només atendre a fenòmens conjunturals o puntuals, sinó també a una acció sostinguda en el temps. Ja fa alguns anys que, des dels primers dels anys 90, aquesta setmana, que precisament hi ha l'Assemblea General de Nacions Unides i que també reuneix, per cert, la Setmana del Clima a Nova York, ja fa alguns anys que es va adoptar la Convenció sobre el Canvi Climàtic, posteriorment, el 2015, si no recordo malament, els acords de París amb les seves successives revisions i, per tant, el conjunt d'estats i també, per què no, les regions i els ens locals, òbviament, saben que estan cridats de manera important a adaptar les seves polítiques i les seves accions a mitigar o, si més no, a adaptar-se a aquest canvi climàtic. I des d'aquesta perspectiva, l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern va voler celebrar aquesta petita jornada, aquesta tarda, per examinar una qüestió com és el paper de les regions, el paper, en definitiva, dels ens subcentrals o els ens subestatals que, en ocasions, desenvolupen fins i tot accions més intenses que els mateixos estats en aquest sentit. Vull posar en relleu, per exemple, que Catalunya és un territori, un país pioner en aquest sentit. Pioner perquè ja l'any 2017, si no recordo malament, va aprovar la seva llei del canvi climàtic, que va ser en el seu moment una llei pionera i va ser una llei que va adoptar un enfocament transversal, holístic, innovador, amb la finalitat o amb l'objectiu de reduir les emissions de gasos d'efecte hivernacle i d'afavorir també la transició cap a energies netes. Malauradament, aquesta llei també els vull dir que va ser recorreguda davant del Tribunal Constitucional, que va anul·lar bona part del seu contingut i seguint, malauradament, una línia jurisprudencial del Tribunal Constitucional espanyol, que ha estat molt falcada i molt condicionada per un model de desenvolupament basat en l'ús intensiu de les energies fòssils. Bé, en qualsevol cas, aquest pronunciament del Tribunal Constitucional, les dificultats que hi pugui haver hagut no són un obstacle per continuar treballant. El propi govern en el seu moment va impulsar una modificació d'aquesta llei per crear un impost sobre les emissions de diòxid de carboni, que també ha estat un tribut pioner en aquest sentit. Els reptes, evidentment, són ciclopis i des de la perspectiva, insisteixo, de les comunitats autònomes o des de la perspectiva de les regions és evident que és molt interessant i, per tant, molt positiu. Almenys així ho pensem, que ens puguem escoltar, que tinguem la immediació de sentir algunes propostes i també que les contribucions que avui es puguin fer en aquest seminari també les puguem llegir, no només escoltar, perquè, com segurament després s'hi referirà l'amic Jordi Hària, que és el cap de l'àrea de difusió de l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern i l'autèntica ànima mater també d'aquest seminari juntament i del congrés, juntament amb el doctor Cacciolo, que ens acompanya, doncs aquestes contribucions formaran part del, no sé si el proper, no, el següent número monogràfic, el corresponent al segon semestre del 2023 de l'Institut d'Estudis, la revista d'Estudis Autonòmics i Federals. Per tant, des d'aquest punt de vista tindrem l'ocasió no només de reflexionar sobre els reptes, sinó també de poder tenir un material important de contingut acadèmic i científic de cara al futur. Moltes gràcies i molt bona feina.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much to the Mayor of Tarragona and to the Director of the Institute for Self-Government Studies. Some introductory remarks to present this side event of the ELF conference of 2022. First of all, some recognition to the Universitat Rovira, Virgili, and particularly to the SEDAT, the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law Studies, for hosting this event. Also for the ELF for its positive disposition to include this side event in the conference. For us, is frankly very important to have the opportunity to debate this kind of issues affecting policies of self-government, particularly in climate change, and having this forum to do so. Thank you also to the Mayor of Tarragona, because as you can suppose, have a very busy schedule because of the local festivities, and he has decided to be with us today and to contribute to this inauguration. He has underlined that the commitment of the City Council with these sustainability issues in terms of mobility and so on. And in fact, the City Council is also one of the partners of the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law Studies. So it's very good news to have the mayor of the city with us. Thank you also to the EURAC for contributing to organize this event. This event is a fruit of collaboration of different institutions, and also EURAC Research has contributed to that. And also to all the presenters for contributing with his views, their views and perspectives to reflect on this important issue. And finally, thank you to Andrews and Maria Chiara for putting all these pieces together, make things so smooth, and spend their talent, their initiative, and their time in this workshop. Climate change is happening and is happening very quickly, and is changing all the rules of the game. So for an institution as ours, which is devoted to the study and research of self-governance, particularly in Catalonia, but also from a comparative perspective, it is almost an obligation to have into account climate change, because the rules of the game are changing, the forms of governance are changing, and these territorial actors play a significant role in climate change issues. In fact, social movements, courts, and local powers have played a game of counter-hegemonic measures against the attitude of several states in terms of being very, very inactive to respond to the challenges of climate change. So it is important to see how local governments and regional governments can contribute to some extent make their contributions in terms of climate change. And the Mayor of Tarragona has talked, for example, how the City Council can contribute in terms of city mobility or in terms of urban planning to react to climate change. Also, in the case of Spain, we have until now an attitude probably caused by this regulatory capture and this sunken cost, to some extent reluctant of the central institutions in terms of energy and climate policies. In this context, autonomous communities, particularly Catalonia, but also Andalusia, the Balearic Islands, etc., have reacted and proposed innovative measures in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So it is very interesting for us, and I expect that also for us, for you to have this picture of how regional powers can contribute to the struggle against climate change, how regional powers can design strategies of mitigation and adaptation, and with have thought that this side event can contribute to the reflection about these new frontiers of environmental law, this need to rethink some of the concepts, some of the tools, some of the objectives, etc. of environmental law with this transversal perspective, which in particular can be seen in climate change policies. So this is a little bit the goal of this workshop. The contributions will be published in our journal, the Journal of Self-Governance Studies, in next year, with the idea of provide these tools of debate to the scholars, but also to the political actors. With the organizers and coordinators of this workshop, Professors Cocholo and Alberton, we have decided to limit the scope of the reflection to the decentralized states in the European Union. This, in our opinion, makes sense to some extent because the problems are shared, but also the big institutional framework is also shared. And we have a significant global player, which to some extent leads this international community in the direction of react against climate change. And we have several states in this mega framework, and then regional governments, which can also contribute to this policy. So we have thought that probably to define in this moment the scope in terms of the European Union makes sense. Obviously, could be interesting to analyze also how other decentralized states react and have some kind of shared problems with the decentralized states of the European Union. But in this moment, we have been to some extent conservatives and limit the scope to the European Union. Finally, a very warm welcome to the city of Tarragona. As the mayor have said, you will be in this town in the best possible time. And we expect that you can enjoy truly the streets, local culture, local food, local conviviality, and that this can be very inspiring for you, not only these days, but that you can pick some memories and preserve it in the future. So really enjoy these days, enjoy the town, make the streets of yourselves, and this will be after the workshop. By now, we try to concentrate. Today is the first stage, so it will be very easy to make that. Probably tomorrow will be a bit difficult, and I'm afraid that Thursday probably we will have some problems of attention. So try to take profit of these first moments of the congress, of the conference, and also of the workshop, and then try to combine as your wish this scientific and this social program of the conference. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to the people who attend this conference, and enjoy it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, before introducing this first panel of the workshop, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Ridao, the director of the Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern, and my colleague, Dr. Jordi Haria, also director of the Journal of Self-Government, for proposing us to organize this research workshop as chair of the organizing committee of the E11 annual conference. I immediately thought that it was a great idea, and the presence of such distinguished speakers and attendees is clear proof of how wise the idea was. Well, the first panel will address climate change law in the experiences of federal states. Therefore, the cases of Germany, Belgium, and Austria will be discussed. Our first speaker will be Dr. Matteo Vermeglia, which is already in the position. So
I'm IT already.
Okay. Matteo is assistant professor of international and European environmental law at the Faculty of Law of Hasselt University. Matteo, 25 minutes for your presentation. Please, you have the floor.
Should I share the screen?
Please share the presentation. Okay.
Skills are good enough. Can you hear me, everybody? Yep. So, well, buona tarda, first of all, and muchas gracias for the invitation to the Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern. I train myself a lot to pronounce it correctly. Andrews, Maria Chiara, Erlak, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's actually a pleasure to share some insights about a country I am a foreigner of, actually, although I fake it very well, perhaps. Well, I think Belgium provides quite some interesting insights for the workshop we are addressing today, as far as climate governance in decentralized states is concerned. As an upshot of the presentation, I would say that Belgium is basically the wonderland of decentralized states. Again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer myself. I deem myself as an environmental lawyer, but I think, especially as a foreigner, to look at how Belgium works is quite fascinating. So to move along with the topics that we'll address here, Andrews here, Maria Chiara asked me three rather straightforward as such questions that I summarize here. So what are the features and practices of decentralized jurisdictions that shape policy making? What are the opportunities and barriers that, of course, decentralized jurisdiction offer to develop and implement policies as far as climate change is concerned? And conditions that somehow influence the pathways and outcomes of climate governance. Well, as an anecdote here, I would say first, I was very flattered by the invitation. So I say the official on the record answer that I gave to Andrews and Maria Chiara was, well, I'm very happy to represent Belgium in this forum. Off the record, my first reaction was, oh my gosh, where do I start with this with Belgium? You know, because to answer these three questions, there is either a very complicated answer or a very neat answer. So my first answer would be, Belgium is a very complicated country, and I would leave it as that. But then I said, look, maybe I should go further than that. So let's start with the big picture. So this summarizes pretty much what we're talking about when we talk about the governance structure in Belgium. You see several different colors. If you do some math here, you would understand exactly what the governance in Belgium looks like. We have one federal state, we have 3 regions, and we have 3 speaking communities. Does anybody of you know exactly how many parliaments are there in Belgium? I will do the math for you. So we have 1 parliament for each regions, which makes it to 3, 1 parliament for the federal states, which make it 4, and 2 parliaments for the language communities. Why 2 instead of 3? Well, because the Flemish one is merged with the actual Flemish government one, which adds up to 6 parliaments, 6 governments, working together in a country with 10.5 million inhabitants, and with 3 different language communities. So we have the Flemish language communities in the north. Hasselt is over there in Limburg, by the way. We have the French-speaking community in the south, Wallonia, and we have very, very tiny bit of German-speaking community, which actually I didn't know about until I very much landed there. But there are 40,000 people who do account for parliament and do account as a community. Now, if I were to start with how competencies and governance powers are allocated among these 6 entities, we will probably have to reschedule the dinner tonight. So I have to somehow summarize this to make you understand exactly what are the main troubles that you would encounter when it comes to this picture. Because basically, when it comes up to Belgium, it comes to making 6 entities, or at least 4, meaning the regional governments and the federal government, sitting together and agreeing on a certain policy for long term, which is, of course, about climate change. You cannot allow for short-termism here, right? So, starting from the map that I showed before, this is basically how the federal structure of the Belgian country works. On the right-hand side, normally what you have on the left-hand side, well, as a rather straightforward federal state, perhaps just like Germany, perhaps Moritz would not agree with that. But normally you have some kind of structured, multi-level, let's say, cooperation governance when you have a federal government, regional governments, subnational or local governments that would have some sort of, let's say, cooperation with some backstops and some mutual restraints. This is not necessarily the case in Belgium. In Belgium, you have what you would call a dual federalism, where basically competencies and powers are equally spread among the federal governments and the regional governments, and in some instances, the communities. So these 6 entities that I mentioned are definitely put on an equal footing. Okay, so you have to start from this assumption, which, to my understanding, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but is rather unique in the EU. Please raise your hand if you know anything that resembles this kind of peace pie meal approach. So starting from this assumption, there are some features that definitely differentiate Belgium from other federal entities. First of all, Belgium is definitely an executive federalism, which means that the governmental level, both at the regional and federal level, are very much influential and basically take all decisions. Parliaments, in another word, are more of a kind of empty rooms as far as big shots decisions are concerned. Secondly, political parties in Belgium play a prominent role, especially at the regional level. So normally, this executive federalism goes hand in hand with the actual political power exercised by political parties regionally. This also must be combined with the view that Wallonia and Flanders and Brussels, as the 3 main regions of the country, have their own political parties, pursuing their own political agenda locally. This is, again, trying to summarize and try to make the picture clearer, because, of course, it's more complicated than that. Second main element, the competencies are heavily fragmented, as I mentioned. So as far as environmental and climate issues are concerned, environmental regulation and energy regulation are mostly in the hands of regional governments, not in the hands of federal government. However, there are some competencies that are in the hand of the federal government. For example, in the field of energy, the federal government retains competence over offshore wind and nuclear power, which are quite boiling issues nowadays. So there is a very heavily fragmented picture in Belgium as far as the legislative competencies are concerned. And then there are, of course, the local stances. I put here the Flemish motto, what we do ourselves, we do better, which kind of summarizes what the eagerness to cooperate would be in certain part of the country. So, of course, this represents an issue of accountability, which I will come back to later. And this, of course, also as a third important, I think, feature, means that basically federal government has no preemption power whatsoever on regional governments, which in turn means that the only way to reach a full-fledged agreement on long-term issues such as policy planning for climate change is to achieve voluntary cooperation. And this, in practice, is done only by unanimity. So again, the bottom line is that you have to put these 6 people together, or at least the 3 federal governments, the regional ministers, together and agree unanimously on some long-term issues. So you see the difficulties to achieve this. Here, I think the slides perhaps will be shared later, so you can check it out yourself. Of course, I'm not running through the whole scheme here, which somehow summarizes, although it's kind of outdated, but basically resembles what the situation is so far. The let's say, governance scheme when it comes to climate decision making. What I want to stress here is that basically the whole, the main decisions taken at the federal level are taken by the so-called National Climate Commission, which basically puts together representatives for the federal governments and the regional governments. But however, of course, it does not as such empower of take any legislative acts as such. It's only a coordinating institution, a coordinating body to really achieve action at the local level. Why? Because of course the competence is still spread and in the hands of the regional governments, not in the hands of the federal state, okay? Then we have all sorts of interministerial kind of setting in place. The stronger one is the so-called cooperation agreements, which in some literature, they are even equal to international treaties as far as the difficulty to get it done and to get some decision done are concerned. So you can imagine how hard it can be to really achieve a certain consensus as far as the regional and the federal government is concerned. Because again, you need unanimity. And remember that Belgium is a partocracy. So to get unanimity, you need to get political consensus all over the country on a certain issue. As far as specifically the climate governance is concerned, there is no, by the way, advisory body on climate change, which we see in some instances, in some countries, like in Germany, for example, which would be, in my view, but not only in my view, perhaps a good way to streamline policies across the country. But for example, this is not the case in Belgium. What is being done in the light of the latest developments at the EU level, namely the governance regulation, the climate law, and all the long-term commitments of the EU that, of course, roll over to the Belgian state, the Pacte énergique, a sort of informal, so to speak, quasi-informal, let's say, agreement across the ministers of energy across the country to sit together basically and set up a coherent strategy and plan for the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions, among other things. So with all this in mind, I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to highlight two upshots of the consequences of this fragmentation in Belgium before answering to the first three questions. First one, the first and only attempt to pass a climate bill in Belgium. That would have been a federal bill that was proposed by a bunch of academics, including my dear colleague also, Carole Billiet in Hasselt. Was, again, originally a very academic exercise that was launched in February 2019, was taken up by the political parties federally, was super fast-tracked at an unprecedented pace before the federal government and the federal parliament. It also got, at a very unprecedented pace, let's say, the go, basically, by the Raad van State, which is the Council of State, which normally, let's say, go for a pre-assessment of federal legislation. So there was a very unprecedented pattern. There was also general consensus in the public opinion. There were kids sleeping before the federal parliament asking for this bill to be passed. We're talking 2019, of course, before Corona. Bottom line, the whole process was rejected by the federal parliament in light of one basic issue, the amendment of Article 7 or the introduction of Article 7 bis in the Constitution. What would Article 7 bis basically say? Article 7 bis would basically bond state, communities, and regions to respect, to abide by climate objectives according to majority law passed by the federal government, which would basically say that under the constitutions, regional governments should forego their prerogatives against a specific stance by the federal government as far as long-term climate targets are concerned. So again, I'm putting it very simply, but I can also answer questions right now, well, later on. Of course, I see that there could be many questions about that. So just to flag that, of course, this political tension arises here and there across several key points as far as climate governance goes. The second one would be the first Belgian National Energy and Climate Plan. Actually, we should have been talking about 3 national energy and climate plans because we will need at least 3, one for each region, right? We have 1 climate plan for each region. Therefore, basically, the NECP came as a result of 3 different climate plans, which could not but result in a sort of political compromise, which ultimately, these are the words of the European Commission, I'm not reinventing the wheel here, basically watered down the utmost ambition of Belgium in terms of, for example, greenhouse gases emission reduction targets and renewable energy uptake targets. Okay, and this, in the words of the Commission, was mostly related to the division of competence between federated states and the regions. And this is a challenge to arrive to an integrated and fully let's say, effective NECP. So this is, again, as an upshot, but just to say just to explain basically what happened in practice over the last few years. So to answer very quickly to the 3 questions that I was asked by Andrews and Maria Chiara. Well, first question, what are the features in Belgium as a decentralized jurisdiction that shape policymaking? Well, first, the fact that basically, from a constitutional perspective, we have a dual yet de facto cooperative federalism. We have very equal, well, we have this situation of share of competencies. We have this equal footing situation among regions and federal government. But de facto, what is needed to make things work in Belgium is cooperation. Cooperation based on unanimity. And this leads to a very complex and difficult decision-making process and a heavy political lift because of the politocracy, or, well, call it as you like, situation that also drives Belgian policymaking. The no hierarchy, the lack of hierarchy and the lack of decentralization, of course, leads to lack of coordination, integration, and oversight over the actual implementation of regional plans. And this, again, is not me speaking, is the EC first and the OECD also last year. And then, of course, comes the issue of exclusivity and autonomy, which also, in light of recent literature, leads to a very utmost rigidity as to how decisions are made in the climate change context, especially. So second question, what are the opportunities and challenges? Well, on the one hand, this consensus democracy and this consociational federation, because there is also background to it, which I don't have time to explain, but of course the setup that is actually put in place in Belgium leads or needs to lead to a sort of pacification between different parts of the country. This is a very important point. We don't have time for that, but perhaps you can explain that later. This leads to the need to broad coalitions, segmented autonomy, veto for minorities, and this, of course, leads to compromises. And the NECP is a clear example of how this can drag a race to the bottom as far as long-term commitments are concerned. And of course, you can agree with me that heavy fragmentation does not add up to the cross-cutting nature of climate change. We need inter-institutional cooperation because climate change is cross-cutting. On the other hand, however, this focus on cooperation can also lead to innovative exercises. I think the COVID-19 responses here was quite an example in this respect. Informal cooperation led to a very much coordinated action in Belgium against all odds. But again, this was beyond the formal agreements and cooperation in place that was on the paper. And again, of course, more coordinated action at the local level could be triggered as far as heavy decentralization is prompted. And this is an example that we have in the US. But of course, this depends on the political will that you have at the regional level. And we don't have the same political will everywhere in Belgium. Lastly, what are the conditions that influence the pathways and outcomes of climate governance? Again, partocracy. We need political symmetry. In Belgium, to get a comprehensive response to a climate change crisis, needs political symmetry, which is not necessarily the case, for example, nowadays. Secondly, another condition that has influenced or might influence is the Europeanization, the external pressures that come over this complex mechanism. The top-down system that is coming towards Belgium as a result of the EU system is against the wait-and-see approach that several regions have had over the years, especially in Flanders. And this is also documented by literature. Lastly, the no hierarchy. Well, again, this boils down to a political will. If you have low political will, this is fostered by decentralized setup and no hierarchy. In the presence of political will, the situation might be reversed. So with this, you have the reference here for later, but I think I even exceeded my time. But I would like to hear questions about the wonderful marvels of Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo. You at all finished your time, so we had the opportunity to recover the 10 minutes that we start later, so we are now in time, according to the plan. So thank you very much. So, okay.
Maybe we change place. See.
Yeah. Oh, it's only this is my presentation. Yeah, it's only on screen. You can put that forward share screen. It's on. Seems so. Okay. Introduce
Thank you, Andrew.
No. So, yeah, just introduce our second speaker, which is Dr. Maurice Reise. He is a researcher at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, Department of Environmental Planning Law in Leipzig. He is the head of the International and European Environmental Law Research Group. Dr. Reise is also the chairman of the managing board of the EELF. So thank you very much to be with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Distinguished host. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me for this workshop and for the conference. I'm very, very happy to be here and to see you all again after many years. I would say a few words more on this, being happy and looking forward to the conference and to being together again after years of pandemics. It's wonderful that you organized the conference. Thanks a lot. And thanks also for organizing this workshop about a very important issue, I think, also in Germany, climate policy, climate law in federal states. And yeah, I think it's also a big issue in Germany, maybe with a little different nuances than in Belgium. I will try to explain to you a little bit the federal system of Germany, how it works in total. Of course, that's a wide field. Yeah, and when we're talking about climate policy, it's a wide field of different fields of policy, energy, buildings, industry, mobility, and all these different fields, of course, function in different ways in the federal system. So please forgive me if I can only draw a rather coarse picture. I will draw your attention mainly to municipal action and to the self-governing powers of the municipalities, because, as I will try to explain now, if you talk about self-governing in Germany, then I think it's mainly about municipalities and communities. But let's start looking at the German federal system. Here on the picture you see a map of Germany, and a very colorful map where you see the 16 German federal states, the Länder as we call them. How does it move? This way, okay. Yeah, and Germany consists indeed of 16 federal states, and it has, of course, a federal government. But I would say it's a three-tier system where you have the federal level, the state level, and the municipalities. Germany, we would also say it's executive or administrative federal system. But what we mean by this is that the legislative powers lay mainly with the federal level. So in nearly all important fields, especially climate policy fields, it is the federal level that has a so-called concurrent legislative power. So the federal parliaments, the governments, they can make laws on all these issues, yeah, and then the Länder level are barred from legislation, or they can legislate where there's still left some room or delegated room by federal laws. Okay, so this means legislation is to a large extent in the hands of the federal level, and the Länder, they also have parliaments, but what they do is rather supplementary legislation. They regulate some details, or they have some fields like education where they have, let's say, original legislative powers. But what the domain of the Länder is execution of the federal laws. So the federal government doesn't have administration to execute federal laws. That's the competence and the task of the Länder. They have the administrations, and they are to execute the federal laws. And I think that's probably the same everywhere. If you execute law, then often you have quite some discretionary leeway. And these discretionary powers, of course, can be used to do more or less on climate change. The main domain of discretionary power of the Länder lies, of course, with spatial planning, infrastructure planning. And that's where with the Länder, they really exert some heavy discretionary powers. And then the third level of the federal system, we must say, are the municipalities. They enjoy a constitutional right to self-governance that's regulated in the German Constitution, Article 28, and especially with regard to local matters, which would be local urban zoning, urban planning, infrastructure development, urban infrastructure like urban transport, public urban transport, and then also, of course, the municipal services like municipal energy provision, public transport, water, and waste services. These are the aspects that are decided and managed by the communities. Let's look a little bit deeper into what these levels are doing in terms of climate policy. And Andreas, please watch time. It's 5 minutes because here it becomes a little bit more complex, and I have to see to not making it too extensive. There is an overall level, I would say. We're looking now at the federal level, and as I said, the domain of the federal level is the regulatory framework. It's also about a little bit about national infrastructure, and then of course we must not forget the funding power of the federal government, which also plays a big role. And there is an overall policy framework on climate action that is framed by so-called climate law. It's rather new in Germany, and I think it's interesting to see whether other countries have such climate laws as well. This climate law is setting out the overall climate targets, the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, also in terms of the Paris Agreement, and of course, as determined then through the European framework and the effort sharing regulation and so on, you know. And now in the climate law, and this is kind of interesting, these targets, these global targets are broken down to sector targets. And these sector targets are attributed to the different ministries. So every ministry has to keep specific sector targets, and there's also some regulations about what happens if they don't, and they have to catch up later on. So that's a quite interesting approach, I would say, on the federal level. And then to this climate law also obliges the federal government to draw up and regularly revise our climate protection program, where the government has to set out the measures by which it aims to achieve the climate targets. And we do have such a federal climate protection program. Now it's interesting noting that there are these overall targets, and then even budgets for the branches, for the minister branches, even though it's a federal system and they have only influence on the federal level, but they cannot say what the municipalities have to do in some terms. So it's interesting that they have the whole responsibility in a way for the emissions budgets, but not the entire competencies to actually implement these budgets. Then if we look at the energy sector, there's of course the emissions trading system as our global approach, which also applies to the industry sector. And in Germany, we have supplemented the emission trading systems by a so-called fuel emission trading system in order to expand emission trading to the branches of buildings, also as parts of mobility. So these are overarching instruments that are applied by the federal level, but also, of course, applied to all the activities on the Länder and on the municipal level. We have on the federal level our Emission Control Act, that is, of course, implementing European law, the IE directive, and regulating emission standards that also influence climate relevant emissions of industries and industry development. Then in terms of mobility, we have national infrastructure competence, especially for national roads and railways, development by the plans are development by the federal government, of course also relevant in terms of climate policy. And maybe we should mention in terms of the building sector that the federal government also sets the legislative framework for spatial planning and zoning. There is a Spatial Planning and Zoning Act that's setting the basic legal framework for planning and zoning, which is then, as I said, done by the Länder and by the municipalities, and granting a great deal of discretion on planning competence to these levels. In the building sector, it's also very relevant that the federal government provides considerable urban development funds and gives it to the Länder and via the Länder to the municipalities, but it also determines for what these funds are actually applied and how far they can be used for climate protection or climate adaptation projects. So this is quite high influence in terms of funding and budgetary powers. If we look at the state level, we see the domains of the state level, as I said, is the execution of the federal laws, spatial planning, and then Länder, regional infrastructure, and also funding instruments. I don't want to go through the details here. I think we provide the slides later on to the audience, and you can have a closer look at it. What I want to say, though, is that it is not always the case that the Länder want to go beyond the government ambitions in climate policy. Sometimes the Länder, because they're closer to their economic interests of their constituents, they're rather laggards. And it's like in a school class, of course, with the federalism. Yeah, you always have good students; they go ahead, they're front runners. But you also have laggards. And what you have to do, you have to provide room to the front runners to go up, go ahead, and be good. Yeah, but also you have to find some way to make the laggards catch up and do their homework. And that's kind of the same thing here. And we see that often the Länder, they're kind of reluctant. For instance, if it comes to developing renewable energy systems and renewable energy sources, there is, for instance, the example of wind energy development, which was kind of stagnating through the last years in Germany, and that was a big concern, of course, also of the federal government. Because the federal government had quite some ambitious aims. It aimed to double wind energy by 2030, but the states were really reluctant to plan for this doubling of the wind energy. And now in the summer, the federal government adopted a wind on land law where it obliged states to devise 2% of their land area to wind energy development installations. So that's just an example how federal government is kind of pushing to the self-governed intermediate level for more climate action. On the municipal level, it's the same. I would say you also have bad students, you have good students, but rather you have a lot of good students. And here I think it's important to actually foster these municipal initiatives. And I think that the cities are, because we live in an ever more urbanized world, and the cities are, I find, very important agents of transformation, where lots of things happen for the first time. They're experimenting, they're trying to develop new carbon-free infrastructures, buildings and developments as a whole. So they're kind of drivers for bottom-up front-runner initiatives and experiments in carbon-neutral infrastructure. And you might know the example of the Climate Leadership Group, the C40 cities that kind of contracted for climate protection, climate adaptation, front-running measures. I don't know if Tarragona is part of that group. perhaps not. Yeah. Yeah, and of course, cities are also rooms for democratic and participatory sustainability transformation. And we're all aware that sustainability transformation involves traditional infrastructures, but also private compounds, buildings. We have to insulate our houses, build green roofs, and much has to be substantially changed. It costs a lot of money, and so it's important to really involve people, and that's what can happen on the municipal level. I want to. How much time? Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's good. That's enough. That's enough. In this regard, I would like to present to you an example. It's an example where I'm involved also as a legal researcher at the Helmholtz Institute, which is actually located in the city of Leipzig. Next year, we are going to have the ELF in Leipzig. It's a beautiful city. I'm also going to say a few more words on that in the conference, at the end of the conference. Anyway, and in Leipzig, there are several big development projects, but there's one particularly big project where we are developing a new city area on the brownfield. There are around 3,000 flats being built with schools, sport facilities, kindergarten, and so on, parks, public infrastructures. And the city council and the mayor committed to making this a front-running quarter in terms of sustainability, in terms of energy, water supply, also social aspects. And in many regards, the city is trying to make this, let's say, environmentally self-sufficient quarter. For example, in terms of water, they're trying to close the water cycle within this area. So rainwater is recycled and used for irrigation purposes, but also sewage water from the structures is collected and cleaned on green roofs and so on. And we're trying to develop what we call a blue-green infrastructure, where green and water infrastructure is combined. I suppose that in Spain you're quite familiar with these concepts of sponge city and so on. So this is, we're trying to develop this as a front-running city in these terms, but also in terms of the energy infrastructure. There are some parts of decentralized energy, and of course, solar roofs and wind energy installations and these things. But this, of course, involves heavy investment, of course, and costs a lot. And in many terms, it's experimental, new infrastructure. So, we need to dare things, and investors need to dare things. And what the city did when it's planning for this investment for this quarter, doing the zoning, it contracted with an investor, and that's a possibility according to German construction law. We can plan just as an offer, but you can also say, okay, I have this investor, and now let's plan, and you can have the quarter, you can develop, but only according to the terms of the contract. And this is a possibility that they use here, and they make quite complex contracts about what to do in terms of sustainable development. And also, of course, there were subsidies granted to the investors and made available, and so on. But it's quite complicated, involves a lot of also legal thinking and work in terms of contracting, in terms of public law also. And what we experienced is that such a project, you encounter lots of questions of what the city can actually regulate, what it can demand of the investors and the proprietors, because it's new. There are many new things that we want to do, and it's not explicitly regulated in the framework. And the framework, as I said, is mainly shaped by federal laws. And this is not explicitly regulated. If you can, for instance, ask the investor to build green roofs or to collect the water and reuse it for irrigation purpose. So you have to be rather inventive, and the administration, that's not always the case. If they're not on the safe side, also in the legal terms, then they rather abstain. They say, okay, no, let's not do it, because then we're going to be sued by the investor, we're going to lose, and so on. So what we see is that here the federal framework is not really innovative, and it's not giving the municipalities the safe, let's say, foundations that they would need to actually plan for such sustainable developments. And also the legal framework in many terms doesn't give enough, let's say, experimental room. Yeah, it prescribes certain solutions and doesn't give the power to the municipalities to say, no, we don't want to use the conservative sewage solution and just dispose the water to the river. We want to do closed cycle. Yeah, and that's hardly possible according to federal law. So what we see here is that we really need to develop the framework, the legal framework, which is mainly shaped by federal law, in order to allow for more experimental room, in order to really empower municipalities to develop such sustainable solutions within their self-governed rooms. And this is, I mean, I'm really curious to learn whether you have similar problems here, for instance, in Spain. Yeah, I think there we can have some exchange on that. And also if you have similar projects, actually, where you really test the legal grounds of these sustainable urban developments. And I think this would be very fruitful to have to really have detailed exchange also about the urban spatial planning foundations, even the standards of water and energy construction. Yeah, I think this sums it up more or less what I just already said. I think what we really have to look at is the legal framework of the municipal self-government in terms of sustainable urban development, that municipalities should be given experimental room, that they should be provided adequate legal standards that allow for sustainable urban development in terms of built infrastructure, public transport, energy, water supply, waste, urban cyclic economy. There are many topics where you can actually look at the framework and find shortcomings, at least in Germany, in these terms. And I think this is something that we can also develop together in a comparative manner. And I'm very much looking forward to the exchange in this regard. And one point I would also like to mention in the end is that, and which I'm kind of curious to learn whether it's similar in other countries, which is also a problem. The municipalities in Germany, by their right of self-government, have no right to interfere with private property or private liberties. Yeah, what they always need is entitlement through federal or state law, through parliamentary laws. So if you want, as a community, if you want to say, okay, on this plot, you can only build, let's say, sustainable building. Yeah? This can only be done if the federal building code or a state building law entitles you as municipality. But you cannot do it just by your self-governing competence. And of course, that's a problem for the municipalities. They are always, they have to rely on federal law entitlements. And yes, I'm curious to learn whether this is also the case in other countries, or whether the communities, the municipalities, have a right by their own, let's say, institutional existence to interfere with the with private property laws and basic laws. Okay, so far I think it's enough for the moment, and many things to discuss. Thank you
very much for your presentation. And yes, we have also in Spain this kind of problem. Actually, we have a strong political will for energy transition, but not an ad hoc legal regime for local entities to make it possible. Yeah, this is an interesting thing that we can have. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And last but not least, our third speaker.
Ja.
Okay. Well, our third distinguished speaker is Dr. Maria Bertel. She is a postdoc researcher at the University of Graz within the Horizon 2020 project of energy, citizenship, and energy communities for a clean energy transition. Thank you very much to stay with her, and you have the floor until 25 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much. And first, I would like to say thank you to Maria Chiara and to Andrews for inviting me and having me here, and for Anna Heile, who was organizing a lot for me. So thank you very much. Let me start maybe with my background, because it's a bit different of the background of Matteo and Moritz. I started as a constitutional and administrative lawyer, researching federalism. So my insights might be a bit different, but as Andrews has pointed out, I'm currently, until the end of the month, still working for the EC Square project, a project on energy citizenship, where we elaborated or compared the framework for energy communities, the legal framework for energy communities, amongst others, also in Spain.
Just maximize, but
it's incredible. After years of the pandemic, I'm still not familiar with every program. So it's, yeah, I have not been teaching enough, apparently, online. So the second project, which influences my thoughts here, is a project on climate change integration in the multi-level governance of Italy and Austria, where I was working with Federica Cittadino from EURAC. What can you expect? I will also shortly present my research question, and then we will look into Austrian constitutional law, to the distribution of competencies. We will look into administrative law, and I'm very glad that Moritz has mentioned already spatial planning law, because that's the most important area, I think. I have also put municipalities here, and I'm also very grateful for the example Moritz brought, because I think that's very similar in Austria. There's quite a lot going on the local level, without maybe always having a real framework. So I think that's something where we are very close. So my point of departure, my research question is, what is the role of the Austrian subnational governments? And my focus will be on the regions, on the Länder, in the field of climate policy. And here's a first preliminary remark. Climate policy does not mean climate legislation. Climate policy also means strategies, where we have our problems in Austria, and that's where I'm very thankful for Matteo's presentation, because it has already shown how much the state traditions, legal culture, political culture influences climate change governance. And Austria has a tradition, a very formalistic tradition. So that heavily influences also climate policy and climate legislation. I have also added voluntary practice here, which I think is very important on the municipal level, on the local level, as well as informal action. So climate change governance is much more than climate change legislation, although I will mainly talk about the distribution of competences in Austria. A third remark, which is worth mentioning, and I think Matteo has already drawn on that, is the strong influence of public, international, and EU law, because in Austria we can also hear the voices which are saying we need streamlining, we need one solution, and I think I can show and elaborate a bit on that later. It's also not only, I think, a call from the, let's say, federal central level, but sometimes also call from the regional level or the Bundesländer level, because it's also a way of solving problems to shift them to the central level. So what is the situation if we look into the Austrian constitution? So Austria is a federal state, although it is a weak federal state. The Länder have less competences than and less influence than they have in Germany. It's not as complicated, and I'm glad about that, as Belgium is. We do have 9 regions, 9 Bundesländer, and this is very important to know. The Austrian constitution and the federal constitution consists of different documents. So we do not have one document like the Grundgesetz or like the Spanish constitution, but we have several documents, and we have even constitutional provisions in ordinary laws. So that makes the picture maybe a bit messy sometimes. The distribution of competences is part of the main document of the federal constitutional law, which dates back from 1920. The document, the distribution of competences, dates back to 1925, and that's very important because in Austria, the Constitutional Court puts much emphasis on the historic interpretation. So new competences tend to be competences of the central, of the federal level. The protection of the climate or fight against climate change in general is not explicitly listed in the Austrian constitution on the federal level. We had a draft amendment to the Austrian constitution a few years ago, and this amendment would have introduced the fight against climate change as a state aim, together with a new provision on the distribution of competences in the field of climate change, with an emphasis on the reduction of emissions. But this was in 2008 already, but this draft was dropped because there was no political consensus, and that's where the presentation on Belgium comes in again. Instead, in 2013, we had a separate constitutional act on sustainability, animal protection, comprehensive environmental protection, on water and food security, as well as research. Again, state aims. And I would argue that these aims together are somehow, or enshrine somehow, climate change, the fight against climate change as a state aim. What we see here is that the land constitutions were much more innovative in a way, because they included fight against climate change protection as state aim in their constitutions earlier. The problem with state aims, and this is probably familiar for the Germans in the room. The problem with state aims is that they are rather weak, and when it comes to the Constitutional Court, the Austrian Constitutional Court is not as as far ahead as the German Constitutional Court, so they are not really put in action yet. I'm emphasizing yet because I expect that the Austrian Constitutional Court does not want to be the last constitutional court in Europe to jump on that train. So I'm very curious what the next cases will bring. A problem we are having is that inactivity of the legislator can not be brought before the Constitutional Court. So when the Constitutional Court is not doing anything, when the legislator is not doing anything, the Constitutional Court cannot do anything. So even if we have a state aim, fight against climate change, if the legislator is just reluctant to do anything, nothing can be done. So that's the caveat with state aims, because they were used in Austria also for making look Austria better than it is. The distribution of competencies. It's in a way maybe simpler than the German distribution of competences, because we do not have concurrent or concurring competences. We have a list of federal competences in the Austrian constitution, and everything which is left over is competence of the Länder. Climate change is not listed as a competence matter of the federal level, so one could be tempted to think that climate change is competence of the Länder. But it is not that easy. Climate change is considered a so-called complex matter, Querschnittsmaterie in German. Cross-sectional matter, we could say. So in the result, it is similar to a concurring competence in Germany. We have parts where the Länder are competent to legislate and parts where the federal level is competent to legislate. And to make the situation even more complex, environmental protection, for example, energy, which Moritz has been mentioning, and spatial planning are themselves, again, so-called complex matters or Querschnittsmaterien. So it gets even more messy. Therefore, as a result, climate change is partly covered by land competences, but I would say mainly by federal competences in legislation as well as in administration. I have listed here just few examples, and they resemble very much Moritz's list. The federal level is mainly responsible for regulation of water, of air pollution, mainly for electricity law, for energy law, mainly regarding funding. And for the Länder, it's not there in red, but I would really frame spatial planning law, because it's a bit, the situation is a bit different to Germany here. We do not have that strong influence of the federal level here, but regarding or the local level, and also the determination of the possibilities of the local level, it's really the regions, the Länder, who have a strong influence here. And what we are seeing, I would say, during the last 3 months is that all the Länder are now implementing provisions regarding climate change, that spatial planning has to take into account the changes climate change brings with. So I am very curious what influence this will have, because right now it's rather aims at the beginning of the laws, but I could imagine that the Constitutional Court, and I'm sure the Constitutional Court will have to decide cases here, I could imagine that it really brings a change. So spatial planning law will be one of the, I think is one of the main fields where the regional level, but also the local level is able to legislate and to act. Maybe let me say, because I have not listed it here, and I feel probably it's because I feel a bit ashamed for Austria in that, or with that regard. We have heard about climate change laws. We have heard about climate change laws in Spain, which are indeed very innovative. We have heard about climate change laws in Germany, and we do have a climate called climate protection law in Austria as well, with regard to reducing greenhouse gases. Why am I feeling a little bit ashamed about it? Because it ended the period. It was foreseen for ended in 2021, so we are now without. It can't be applied anymore. So that's why I don't really. It's not really worth talking about it yet. And it's again, we are lacking a political consensus on that. So that's again a similarity to Belgium. I would, before I shortly talk about municipalities, if time is still okay, I would just like to say something about the strategies, because Moritz has also pointed out the national energy and climate plans. And I already said that we have a little bit of a problem with strategies, because strategies and plans coming from EU law are not a recognized source of law in Austria. So we always need a legislator implementing the targets and the aims into national law, so it can be really enforced and applied. The situation regarding municipalities is, I think, very, very interesting and very important also for the future. We have, similar to Germany, a certain degree of autonomy guaranteed to the Austrian municipalities already in the federal constitution. And the federal constitution is quite explicit and gives the local level a quite strong position regarding the autonomy. But the municipalities do not have lawmaking competencies, and if they want to regulate on an administrative level, this is limited or bound to the regulation of local interests. So the question arises, what about climate change? Is climate change a local issue? And there I would say, and we heard it already in the introduction, I think there it really makes sense to distinguish between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And I would say regarding climate change adaptation, municipalities do have a local interest, because it's often the municipalities who are knowing best which things they have to change. I will not go into details, but the autonomy plays a role in spatial planning law because the zoning is up to the local level. For example, where do we want to have green areas? And municipalities are responsible for public services, and they can act as stakeholders in renewable energy projects. And that's something we have seen we are seeing in Austria, but I think also in Spain, that, for example, regarding energy communities, it is often public institutions, not necessarily the local level, sometimes universities, which are taking part in an energy community, for example, in the Austrian case. So I think there is very much going on the local level. There are two things I could observe in looking mainly into the administrative law. One is linked to what Moritz has said last, this need for space, this need to try out things in a kind of safe legal area. I think in energy law on the EU level, we have regulatory sandboxes. Probably we need something like that for spatial planning law. We can see that in Austria, so-called evaluation clauses, and it's also the influence of EU law, are coming into the national law. So that might also be a strategy that the government has to evaluate after 5 years. Does this really work, this law? And what we also see in the Austrian case, and that's my last point I would like to mention, what we see is that although much is going on the regional and the local level, we have a certain tendency for centralized laws, because we have, as I said in the beginning, we have the possibilities to have constitutional provisions in simple or in ordinary laws. So, for example, with the Renewable Energy Act, what Austria did was to have a paragraph 1 saying that everything that is regulated in this act falls into the competence of the federal level to avoid problems with this very complex situation regarding the cross-sectional matters. I first thought that's really bad for regions and for the Länder, but in the literature it's not seen as very bad because it's only a temporary centralization. It can be changed again, and it's, at least that's what I read in the literature, it's said that, yeah, since it can be taken back, it's better than a competence matter of the federal level regarding climate change. But those are two observations. I am very much looking forward to the presentations of Italy and Spain, and also curious whether we might see that regional states might be even stronger or might even have a stronger role of regions and municipalities than a federal state like Austria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all three thought-provocative presentations. Luckily for us, we will have time after the second panel for a question and answer time. So now it's time to have a coffee break of half hour, and well, will we start again at 5:15? Okay, thank you. Okay, we are ready to resume the session with the second panel. The second panel addresses the issue of climate law development in regional states. This is where the experiences of the Spanish and Italian legal systems come into play. The first speaker is Dr. Manuela Mora Ruiz. She is an associate professor of administrative law at the University of Huelva. She's an expert in the field of environmental law and a great friend of our center, which she always collaborates with great generosity. Thank you, Manuela. You have the floor.
Okay. So just 1 minute to thanks to the Institut, the Studios del Autogovern. I don't know if I have pronounced it in Catalan very nice and rightly. And thank you very much, Professor Andres Cocholo and Dr. Alberto, for their invitation to come here. It's always a pleasure to come to Rovira Virgili University because I have more than colleagues here. So I have to speak about climate change, energy transition, and regional decentralization in Spain. I would like you to show you some key features of the protagonism of autonomous communities in combating climate change, so that we could have a look to the space-time coordinates in Spanish legislation on climate change and energy transition. The basic competencies of the state and the competencies of the autonomous communities, and the specific regulations state in Act 7, 2021 regarding the autonomous communities. After that, I would like to talk to you about the autonomous community models for combating climate change, to show you the different models that we have, to finish with some final remarks. So, talking about the space-time coordinates in Spanish on climate legislation on climate change and energy transition, current Spanish legislation on climate change and this energy transition has been inspired by initiatives taken by the autonomous community governments and also by State Act 721 on climate change and energy transition, which has come into force at a complex juncture when the planet's environment is increasingly vulnerable. Similar laws as partial legal solution passed in the autonomous communities of Catalonia, Andalusia, and Balearic Island, and more recent in Navarra, fit with this response at global general level by the Spanish state through Act 721. This legislation was the expected response of a state government and should be implemented with immediate effect if the goals of climate neutrality and change of productions model set out in Article 1 of Act 721 are to be achieved. This law was unsurprising in terms of its legislative perspective, as it incorporated Spain's international commitments to fight climate change and undertake the transformation of the current energy model of production and consumption. Nevertheless, the Paris Agreement and the European Union Strategy on Climate Mitigation and Adaptation both seek to encourage the involvement of infra-state entities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to articulate a climate governance that features a plurality of actors. That is my starting point, because the type of multi-level government required by international entities can be a formula for a legislative strategies to combat climate change and promote a new energy model that involve the autonomous communities, in the case of a Spanish state, without fear of state interference to meet Spain's international commitments while taking into account the uniqueness of each autonomous region. This approach is fundamental to ensure that Spain's autonomous communities have a recognized role in the adoption of measures to deal with climate change, given that the territorial aspects of it, as well as boosting adaptation and enabling such measures to be executed effectively. Decisions on countering climate change taken at international level shape national policies on the environment, which in the case of Spain, a decentralized state, requires participation on infra-state entities for successful outcomes. If there is to be a paradigm shift in the energy model, it is clear that central government alone cannot achieve this without the active participation of regional governments and private entities as well. On the other hand, in legislative terms, it cannot be said that Act 721 is ex novo, as its approval has been preceded by similar legislation passed by 3 autonomous communities that had stepped in to fill the legal vacuum at the state level, enacting laws on the climate in line with the European Union's climate and energy framework, and in accordance with Article 149.1 to 23 of the Spanish Constitution. In fact, Act 721 stipulations mirror legislation already adopted in autonomous regions around Spain to combat climate change from 2017. Nevertheless, although Act 721 states the need for coordination and cooperation between administrations, it fails to provide a solid legal configuration for multi-level governance to tackle climate change or instigate a thorough revision of the mechanisms and instruments that direct relations between the state and the autonomous communities. In effect, Act 721 regulatory model on climate change and energy transition is the essential legislation for tackling this phenomena, but it remains unsatisfactory as it doesn't seem to guarantee full autonomous community participation in instigating necessary instruments to combat climate change and drive the energy transition, even though some autonomous communities already have regulatory experience in this field. With regard to the competencies between the state and the autonomous communities, the basic state features of the current regulatory model on climate change and energy transition can be understood in terms of its adherence to the constitutional provisions you can see on the slides. Both the Spanish Council of State and the Constitutional Court have endorsed state intervention to mitigate climate change and direct energy transition. One of the features of this regulation on climate change in Spain is the justification of a model that rests on the basis established by the state that limits autonomous communities' power or options to articulate this legislation, and mainly for 2 reasons. First of all, because the law encompasses the most recent constitutional jurisprudence, which conditions the autonomous communities' right to set their own targets for greenhouse emission or climate neutrality. Second, and closely connected to this, because it is clear that although this legislation is primarily environmental, the economic implications linked to the transformation of the model of energy production and consumption is undeniable. In fact, the complexity of the environment as a ministerial competence to be used to pass legislation with environmental objectives, as in Act 721, is what is under examination just here. The profiles of the environment as an object of protection are diffuse, from my point of view, and the difficulty in delimiting them increase if they overlap with other ministerial competencies that enact basic legislation, as is said in sections 13 and 25 of Article 149 of our Constitution. And this can encourage the unilateral determination of basic legislation. The truth is that the preamble of the state law makes it clear that it is an environmental regulation, but with the speciality that the fight against climate change and the need for energy transition are at the same time, as it is literally said in the law, a key vector of the economy and society. The principle of sustainable development continues then to be a cornerstone in the regulation carried out by the law, but currently requires an additional element for transformation of the economy model that, in my opinion, makes the invocation of Article 149.13 natural. Obviously, there is a risk of an excessively conservative regulation that tends toward centralization. And this must be balanced as a consequence of the territorial element that combating climate change implies, fully enabling the competence of the autonomous communities to develop the basis set out by the state for raising the level of environmental protection. As the preamble in fact said, especially indicates. The legislation invokes the environmental principle of non-regression and links it to the basis development relationship in such a way, it's said by the law, in such a way that the autonomous communities can establish levels of protection that are higher than the basic state legislation, given that it recognizes the existence of a legislative interconnection. Therefore, and this is what I want to point out, it seems that Act 721 guarantees a space for the autonomous communities to wage their fight against climate change and transform the energy model, but without any clear direction or one that particularly favors the autonomous community. That's the problem, in fact. Thus, the autonomous community should be given, in the basic state framework, the opportunity to articulate policy on countering climate change, to exercise their competencies for development that are substantive and not merely restricted to improving organizational structures. In my opinion, the opportunity for autonomous communities to raise the level of environmental protection in the regions, as Act 721 says, is not programmatic, but a real competence which, within this framework of limitations set by the Constitutional Court, enables them to design strategies to fight climate change. That's the interesting point. This needs to be reinforced by constructing a genuine multi-level connection between the state and the autonomous communities to revise and overhaul instruments for cooperation and coordination. Regarding the specific regulations of Act 721 that show us which is the real connection between the state and the autonomous communities, the first thing is that, at least from my point of view, Act 721 doesn't strengthen the position of the autonomous communities in articulating a multi-level model to fight against climate change because of the preponderance of economic aspects linked to the development of the new energy model proposed, on which the Constitutional Court has already pronounced, namely that the role of the autonomous communities in articulating their own energy model is more limited. In my opinion, this is a position that neglects fundamental instruments to be used in the fight against climate change, as it's set out in the Paris Agreement, such as the so-called national contributions. That means that everything that is done in a country will amount to the achievement of the reduction goals assumed by the state. This is therefore a basic law determining the role of the autonomous communities in the fight against climate change that is narrow and somewhat unsatisfactory from perspectives such as multi-level governance or administration, which in this case is top-down and not bottom-up. This should be said, or should be required. No? In fact, Act 721 considers the autonomous communities to be active subjects in achieving the goals established in this law, fundamentally by establishing calls for coordination and cooperation with the regional governments, especially in the general section of the Title I of the law regarding objectives and planning of the energy transition, and Title IX of the law about governance and participation. Nevertheless, there is a provision for the autonomous communities to intervene in particular sectors such as renewable energies, sustainable mobility, in accordance with the regional government's own competencies, which introduce a territorial element to these measures. These provisions could reveal a certain multi-level framework for action by the public administration. However, my critical reading of the situation is that inter-administration relations seem to be more about coordination, with the role of the state remaining prevalent. In this sense, Act 721 refers expressly and exclusively to inter-administrative cooperation on climate change and energy only in Article 38, and goes no further than imposing an obligation of the autonomous community to inform the Coordination Committee for Climate Change Policies of all their plans for energy and climate change in force, with a limited space for cooperation that is even ambiguous from a point of view, as there is a little definition of what information the autonomous communities must deliver. The autonomous communities are undeniable active subjects in the fight against climate change. Act 721 guarantees it as a basic norm in the terms I have already said, but it's uncertain whether this involvement amounts to them being entities to the extent that the model of inter-administration relations set out in Act 721 upgrades the principles of coordination and cooperation in order for them to meet the demands of multi-level governance indicated. Act 721 is complex and heterogeneous in its provisions, and this is reflected in the way it deals with relations between the state and the autonomous communities. The end result is both complex and unequal, and fails to clearly identify a model for multi-level governance that is out of necessity vertical in nature, in the face of the complexity of the strategies to fight climate change. If we have a look to the autonomous community models for combating climate change, these basic characteristics of Act 721 have an immediate effect on the actions previously undertaken by the autonomous communities. In this sense, autonomous communities that haven't yet formalized their climate change and energy transition policies into law now have a framework within which to work in order to flesh out the measures and instruments which, however, are provided for in their respective strategies to combat climate change. Consequently, these autonomous communities find themselves on a strong legal ground in terms of the path to follow if they opt for passing their respective laws on climate change. This is true in the case of the autonomous community of Navarre, which recently passed Act 4 2022 on climate change and energy transition. The opposite occurs with the autonomous community of Andalusia, Catalonia, and the Balearic Islands, which have all legislated on climate change to the limits of their competencies, and which now find themselves on shifting ground in that their regulations could come into conflict with the basic legislation, which obliges the autonomous communities to revise their respective laws on climate change. All Spain's autonomous communities are aware of the need to adopt measures to counter climate change in the regions, and this has contributed to the configuration of a sort of the autonomous policy, community policy, to combat climate change and even to change their models of energy production and consumption. The key will be the level of decentralization permitted for autonomous communities to be effective and capable in terms of raising the level of environmental protection and reaching greenhouse gas emission and climate neutral goals once basic state law is fully enforced. The main general common features of these regional laws are the following. Firstly, the environmental legislation enacted by the autonomous community is grounded in the organic law of the Statute of Autonomy, which enables a solid legal structuring of any system dedicated to combating climate change and driving energy transition. Besides, all autonomous community laws approved so far internalize the climate-energy binomial as the cornerstone of any strategy to control climate change and reach climate neutrality, which constitute two inseparable and complementary goals for this binomial. Secondly, a third and transversal tendency can be identified in these autonomic laws in the sense that they want to exert influence on all administrative actions and sectors of activity possible. This approach is seen fundamentally on the consideration of adaptation and mitigation as the two main weapons to fight climate change. This is, for instance, the adaptation provisions of the Catalan climate change, or the idea of exemplary administration in the Navarre Act. And thirdly, the autonomous laws passed so far transform climate change planning into a key aspect of the models for combating climate change by offering a strategy framework in which to develop actions by the regional governments that should even extend to other areas of planning. All these laws approved by the autonomous communities provide for a design of a cascade planning model from a plan based on a regulatory programming framework. And finally, these laws involve both public and private entities in striving to attain the goals which are set in the framework of a principle of shared responsibility, which is set in the Andalusian law, or the idea of participation in order to achieve good climate change governance in the Navarre law. The conclusion that can be drawn from this is that despite the particularities of each autonomous community's laws on climate change, none is diametrically opposed to the basic law. And these are regulations that the drafter intend to be permanent without harming the adjustment that need to occur in essential aspects such as planning, which should be seen as fully integrated and connected to the national plans on climate change and adaptation. I'm okay on that. Yeah. Even in the case of Navarre, which is an exhaustive regulatory framework that provides that community with substantial content to raise the level of protection. Finally, some reflections. First of all, Act 721 constitutes a turning point for environmental law in Spain in terms of configuration. I think this is an opportunity to configure climate legislation with norms and provisions for instruments of intervention that differ from or are complementary to those that have characterized the instruments of environmental law so far, or even market or self-controlled instruments, which in my opinion are more sophisticated. We see the incorporation of new principles to the law, such as resilience linked to the concept of vulnerability, which are going to demand different ways to apply the classic instruments of administrative law, such as planning. And what is needed is a flexible law of environment that offers legal security and capacity for planning, but also for anticipation and resilience. We have already heard about the need of a local entity to have a framework to react to the needs of the fight against climate change. That's the idea of a flexible law, no? Of climate law. And from my point of view, the immediate effect for our legal system of the recognition of a climate law is the need to revisit the relation between the state and autonomous communities, considering that the most effective strategy for combating climate change necessitates the participation and active involvement of infra-state entities. Thus, Firstly, it is necessary to formulate an alternative constitutional basis development binomial agreement. And in this sense, Act 721 must represent an opportunity to overcome a tendency toward a unilateral determination of the basic aspects of the law, by favoring a process of clear specification of the reach of the basic legislation, more dynamic, with the participation of the autonomous communities, in particular when they take the initiative to pass legislation on environmental development as a result of their capacity to raise the level of protection. Those responsible for drafting Act 721 appear not have thought very deeply about the path taken by the autonomous communities in already passing laws on climate change, contrary to the change that should be happening. However, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Act 721 offers a heterogeneous legal framework for the presence of the autonomous communities in the various areas for action to counter greenhouse gas emissions, to adapt to climate change, and shift the energy paradigm with the law envisages, but by which it's possible to articulate competencies for the regulation and management of the environment on multiple levels of governance. The climate change law passed in Navarre is an example, in my opinion, of the potential for autonomous communities to occupy their own space to take climate change under basic state law. In this sense, the limited space initially afforded for the autonomous communities by Act 721 for adopting an active role in fighting climate change must grow in the process of the implementation of the legislation. Certainly, the law should contain provisions that confer a preferential position for the state ahead of the autonomous communities as a guarantee of compliance with the international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve climate neutrality. But the same provisions should combine with more sophisticated forms of cooperation that can upgrade the relations between the state and autonomous communities, especially when there is a clear common interest in counteracting the threat to the climate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for your presentation. Absolutely, I share with you most of the concern, the interpretation, and the disappointment about the state regulation of climate, and the interesting point of view about the regional regulation. And if the public allow me the joke, Manuela stayed into the time, and which is the proof that we broke the Iberic tradition, and therefore it's looked like a German workshop. So sorry about that joke, but okay. So last but not least, my dear colleague Maria Chiara Alberton will address.
Doing the damages.
Okay, this is the Italian part of the work. Yes. Okay. Okay, we are ready now. Okay, Maria Chiara will address the Italian case. Maria Chiara, she is a senior research in environmental law at the Institut for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. Research focuses on multi-level governance of the environment and climate change. So you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrews, for this nice presentation. And I would like to thank, in particular, the Institute for Self-Government Studies because of two reasons, mainly. Because right now we are here because the idea was launched by the Institute. And so we collaborate also in organizing this event, but the inputs came from the Institute. And I have to thank the Institute also because before the COVID, the pandemic spread out worldwide, I was able to be funded for 3 months, and so to be hosted by the University of Tarragona, the Rovira and Virgili University, to write my monograph. So I would like to thank the Institute, and I would like to also thank in particular my wonderful colleagues of the University of Tarragona. I think you will enjoy the same familiar atmosphere which I enjoyed before the COVID here. And Jordi already explained what is going on this week in Tarragona, and I've been here in a different time of the year, but it was nonetheless one of the best experiences I had of abroad research. So I'm really thankful for this to both the university and to the Institute. Having said that, I will go with my presentation on the Italian case. Well, a lot of troubles. Not only the Belgian case is complex, but also the Italian case, as you can imagine. So I will provide just some background infos on the division of competencies between the state and the regions in Italy and the subnational levels in Italy, because this helps us to really understand a little bit more about the climate change policy and legislation in Italy. And then I will conclude by identifying some current problems and trends, and also counter trends which link to the municipality role in Italy. So, first of all, I have to also anticipate that as the Belgian case, the Italian case is quite interesting because what is written in the Constitution is not implemented properly, or well, let's say that regarding the institutional setting of the Italian model, we have the law in the book and the law in practice. So it takes decades to implement some constitutional reform or the Constitution itself. Why? Because the Constitution of 1947, adopted in 1948, set out the main features of the Italian system as a regional state, which means that the Italian constitution recognizes and promotes autonomy, but in fact, even if in the text of the Constitution we have 15 regions holding an ordinary statute and 5 regions holding an autonomous statute, just the 5 regions holding autonomous statute were established from the beginning of our Constitution time frame. So this means that it took several decades to have the other regions established just in the 70s of last century. Of course, this makes the system quite different because it's not implemented from the beginning. So the original idea was not the one developed after some years. This means that, for example, at the very beginning, the state was the only player beside the autonomous regions, having and holding all the powers, both legislative powers and administrative powers. And it was only during the 80s, more or less, that also the ordinary regions not only were established 10 years before, but they received from the state, so the state transferred the administrative and legislative competencies. This delay was marked, let's say, the era of non-implementation of the constitutional chart. But then we had a constitutional reform in 2001, which reformulated again the division of competencies between the state and the regions and the autonomous provinces. And once again, we are still waiting after 20 years a complete implementation of what was called the federal reform. In 2001, in particular, there was this change in the division of powers between the different government levels, which caused a lot of intergovernmental conflicts, and then some recentralization trends, and also thousands of challenges before the Constitutional Court, which somehow blocked also the implementation of especially environmental legislation. On the other hand, this constitutional reform of 2001 was also important because opened up the possibility to other regions, the ordinary regions, to have more autonomy in certain fields. So the regions were able to ask for more competencies, for example, on environment and other related issues. But then again, the attempts some regions made from 2002 and 2008, and these regions were Veneto, Toscana, Lombardia, and Piemonte, all these attempts to acquire more legislative and administrative powers failed from the beginning because the negotiations failed. With the state failed. So more recently, in 2017, 2018, some regions, again the same ones, Lombardia, Veneto, Emilia-Romagna, and then also other regions followed, were able to start the negotiation to acquire more competencies from the state, especially in some areas and including the environment. But again, after a preliminary agreement was signed between the state and these regions, everything was blocked. So no more powers were transferred from the state to the regions. And now we will have the upcoming elections. We'll see the results in 1 week, more or less. And we'll see what's next about these process. But probably nothing will happen for real, even if the right parties will be voted by the majority of the Italians, because as they were already ruling the state, they were not able to implement this autonomy reform and this federalism process. So I wonder if this time, I don't know, maybe, but this was fundamental, especially for those of you not so familiar with the Italian system, to understand better what's going on in Italy right now when we talk about intergovernmental relations between the state and the regions and the autonomous provinces. So under this system, climate change is not an explicit topic of state regions competencies. In particular, we have a division of competencies, legislative and administrative competencies under Article 117, which gives a list of exclusive competencies to the state, including environment. And then it gives some other competencies. It gives some competencies also to the regions, which are concurrent with the state. And then there is a final group of residual, non-explicitly mentioned competencies, which are left to the regions. So we don't have a provisions on climate change issues, and so this means that most of legislation on climate-related issues had to be derived from the other competencies listed in the constitutions. And in particular, climate change has been implicitly, of course, subsumed under environmental competencies first, and then climate change goals also impinges on different sectorial legislation, different sectorial policies, and according to this aspect of transversality of climate change, then of course, we can find also some competencies and sectorial competencies under, for example, energy, transport, land use and planning, and so on. As I was mentioning, the environment is an exclusive legislative power held by the state, while other competencies such as energy, civil protection, health, land use planning, transport are shared between the state and the regions. This means that the state can introduce some the fundamental principles and also enact framework legislation, while the detailed legislation is left to the regions. And then I was also mentioning that there is a left residual competence of the regions in some other not explicitly mentioned fields, such as agriculture, forests, which are also relevant for climate change policy. And then administrative powers are let's say, follow a different principle. So they are distributed according to the subsidiarity principle. As I was mentioning, this constitutional division of competencies has raised a lot of problems in Italy, in particular with reference to all the climate change policy issues and policy implementation. Because the state holds exclusive competence on transversal fields and topics, which is climate change, a good model and example. And also there is, let's say, based on this exclusive competence of the state on environment and on climate-related issues, there is a process, an increasing process of regional powers erosion and regional power compression. And there is a general decentralization of shared and residual legislative and administrative powers intercepted by the exclusive state competencies. In addition to this, so in addition to these two tendencies, there is also another feature of our system which really prevent a good implementation of climate change policy, which is the lack of a strong cooperative mechanism which is able to include regional interest in the national decision-making process. So all the conflicts between the state and the regions are just funneled before the Constitutional Court, basically. If we consider in particular the time frame before, after the constitutional reform of 2001, so from 2001 and 2022, the environmental and energy fields have proven to be among the most contentious ones for state-regions relations. And this, also the intervention of the Constitutional Court has proven to be, let's say, not in favor of balancing regional and state interests and competencies, because it exacerbates through the years the conflict between the state and regions and autonomous provinces. So this, let's say, conflictual situation between the governmental levels, of course, has effects on the quality of the legislation and the quality of policy making. So the high number of conflicts marked in a very negative way the effectiveness and coherence also of climate change legislation and policy, not only the environmental legislation. So going to the legislation, we don't have a specific law on climate change. Probably some of you heard that in Italy in 2019 was passed a law on climate change, but in fact it was a decree, so not a law of the parliament, but an act of the government, which was called the climate decree, but was not really a climate law. It was rather a combination of different articles on several sectors. For example, there were some articles on improving air quality, but this was mainly a response to EU obligation, and it was, let's say, implemented in order to avoid another infringement procedures by the European Commission. So these kind of measures were included in this so-called climate decree. Other measures were incentives, so financial measures in order to encourage sustainable mobility in metropolitan areas, or sustainable mobility for schools. Then there were some reforestation measures, and then there was also an article on gathering and also publishing environmental data, and then some incentives were provided for bulk products. So as you see, this is, let's say, a combination of different measures, but not really a climate law. So another aspect of legislation concerning climate change in Italy is that it is really fragmented. And so we can find different measures on climate change in different environmental laws, such as in water, air, or environmental impact assessment laws, but also in energy laws or in transport laws. So they climate change measures are distributed in many different sectors and different laws. Then another aspect of this way, let's say, of distributing competencies and powers, which is an aspect that probably is common also with Spain, is that there was an increased use of governmental decrees and executive acts instead of laws enacted by the parliament, also with regard to climate change and environmental protection. And then almost all the regional laws, including restrictions to national provisions or including detailed implementation of national laws, in particular with regard to energy and environment, and so also on climate change, have been brought before the Constitutional Court. And most of them were reformulated after that. So the final aspect I would like to mention regarding national legislation on climate change and energy issues is that this legislation is in response mostly to EU obligation and directives. So it does not show an innovative character, but we can include the Italian legislation and the Italian system among the laggards instead of the front runners in climate change, talking about the European member states. So what are the current problems and trends in climate change governance in Italy? Some of them are already clear from the previous things I explained, but I would like to recall them here. So first of all, climate change challenges the current constitutional distribution of powers between the state and the regions and the autonomous provinces, and also challenges the present capacity to cooperate, because it's a very complex and transversal field. Like the environment, but even more complicated because it has also to deal with energy, for example, or it has to deal with a lot of other sectors. So it's very transversal, and this means that the distribution of competencies right now is not working. The need to respond to climate change accelerates the decentralization trend, already ongoing, for example, for the environmental fields, but is stressed even more, this process. And then another aspect is the lack of intergovernmental cooperation, which brings to high levels of constitutional conflicts, because, as I said, there are different competencies which are given to the state or to the regions, and then this division of competencies brings to open conflicts of different levels of government. And then the final aspect is that with the climate crisis getting more pressing, the actions taken and the legislation enacted seem to expand, which leads to further fragmentation. So if these are the negative aspects of the climate governance and legislation in Italy, there are some, let's say, hopes and also positive aspects I would like to underline here. First of all, the role played by the subnational levels, which is somehow prevented from the state when we see the legislation. Then when we analyze the strategies, the plans, the policy guidelines on mitigation and adaptation measures, then the role of subnational actors is much important. And then the subnational long-term objectives of carbon neutrality become more ambitious than national ones, and sometimes even anticipate national actions in terms of timeframes and deadlines. This means that, for example, if the carbon neutrality deadline for Italy is 2050, like in other European countries, according to the European legislation, there are some, for example, also the autonomous provinces, but also some other regions which are trying to reach those objectives before. So they are anticipating these neutrality objectives to 1 decade before. And then another positive aspect of climate change governance is that there is a need, of course, to adapt to climate change impacts, and this need accelerates a decentralized local action, which is more tailor-made and adjusted to territorial needs. So in this area of action, especially in the adaptation to climate change, there is a big role that some national levels and also in particular municipalities can play. And then the last aspect is that innovative subnational action is growing also as an effect of EU support initiatives, and this was also mentioned by others in previous presentations. So the EU is supporting a lot the local level in order to implement policies of adaptation, but also policies which are in line with the EU objectives. And so they, let's say, facilitate also a decentralization process within the countries. And then I stop here because I know there is an interesting debate following this presentation. So I leave it to Andrew's. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Maria Cara, for presenting so clearly a really complex and fragmented legal framework as the Italian one. So according to our program, now it's time for the Q&A session. So our colleague Jordi Haria will chair this roundtable. Maria Chiara.
Thank you, Andrews. Well, thank you all the presenters for this very interesting and inspiring presentations, and sure that there is a space for reflection, but also for debate. So if you if you agree, we start space for discussion. So we will make the things in the following way. We have a wireless microphone. So if you want to take the word, please raise your hand, and we give you the well, some technical problems, but and we will give you the floor. Please try to be brief in your interventions, but feel free to make not only questions but also comments, observations, bringing ideas in the discussion. So we start immediately. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you to all the 5 speakers. My name is Volker Maufer. I'm from Mid-Sweden University. For me, after these 5 speeches, really the question raises, is there anything that works in general? Or is it all a matter of how the state is organized, how the competences are distributed? Or what would be the skeleton of a climate law? What should be really on the federal level? What should be really on the local, municipal, whatever we call it, regional level? So what is it? What also this workshop should achieve? Yeah, or is it just complicated? Yeah, and we know it's complicated in every state. Yeah, whatever. So what can we take with, and where do we provide solutions as lawyers? Also in terms of causality, has anybody found that law was really causal to bring the greenhouse gases down in any nation? So just as a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Volker. Well, if the panelists want to make some comment on the questions or suggestions made by the public, feel free also to bring the floor. So, okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Till Markus, also from the Helmholtz Center in Germany. I just would like to add on basically to your question, Volker, and we've listened explicitly to I heard explicitly you saying, the competence as they are distributed right now, it doesn't work, and obviously was the case from Matteo's Belgium example, but I didn't hear those sentences basically from the other 3 speakers. So there seems to be some idea that in some countries the distribution of power is maybe not as big an issue as it is in other countries. So maybe we can learn from these 3 examples and ask those speakers whether they think the competences are distributed okay or even well. So maybe Moritz, maybe you, Maria, or yeah, obviously not Matteo, sorry, yeah, but by you, of course, from Austria. So it adds really on to your question. So yeah, maybe you want to say something, Moritz.
Moritz.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's always difficult to speak about competence in general if we talk about climate policy, because it's, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, it's such a broad field, and you have to look at all the different branches separately, I think, in order to really get to meaningful evaluation of whether competences are distributed effectively. At least I think that would be the case for Germany. You have to look specifically at energy, at the fields of energy policy, at let's say planning law, at building and construction, and other fields like mobility and so on. Yes, of course, you can add also mitigation, adaptation, also different fields. Yeah, and I mean, talking about the German system, I think it is at least quite transparent and works well in that sense that I think the players pretty much know what they have to do and what they're responsible for and what they have in terms of competences. I'm not sure if in any instance they're actually distributed effectively. One thing what I think could be a general observation is, and that I mean, and I was mentioning this example of the class and the laggards and the front-runner students. And I think what the teacher, the central state, should provide is a minimum level of protection. So that's your homework, and everybody has to do the homework. And if you and you and you have not done your homework, then this will be enforced by the central state. And that's my competence to enforce it. But as regards the front-runners, I think they should have room to do their front-running, to be better. That should be their competence. And I heard that from you, Manuela, I think in Spain. That's a major competence of the autonomous regions, as I understood you, that they are entitled to raise the level of protection, which is also the European model, as you know, articulated in the European Treaty, that member states are entitled, as regards environmental policy, to raise the level of protection. In Germany, this is not the case, actually. There is no such entitlement in the constitution for the states or the municipalities, nor general entitlement to raise the level of protection, which is strange in a way. I think there should be a thing like that. Yeah, and it's interesting to learn how this is actually, whether it's the same in other states or whether they have this logic idea that, let's say, the regional or local constituent should have the right to raise the level of protection, actually.
Maybe also incentive to raise the level, right?
Even incentive.
Yeah.
Maria?
Oh, sorry. Oh,
Manuela, Mateo, Maria.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I think that, it is a matter of a distribution of competencies, and it's not a matter of that. Sometimes, some days it is, and some days it isn't. That's what I want to mean is when we are talking about fight against climate change, we are not talking just about environmental competencies, but economic and energy competencies. And that's the difficult point, the black point in the Spanish model, because the Constitutional Court have already said that autonomous communities cannot extend or be more ambitious in the objectives, in the quantity of objectives. So what I also wanted to say is, okay, we should to rethink about how to implement the constitutional competencies, because it doesn't work when we talk about climate change like it is right now, and like the Constitutional Court understands this game of distribution, the relationship. But on the other hand, what I wanted to mean it before is we have to rethink how to build the law, how to pass the law, because the Act 721, that I mentioned a lot of time, is how to say that, should be pensada, in another way, with the cooperation of the autonomous regions. It's just a matter of a process from bottom up, back up bottoms, like a bi-directional process. That was, I think, and maybe it's not the solution, but what we have to do is to think how to build the law in a different way. It's not just a matter of be in front of the communities.
Thank you very much for the questions. I have maybe not a real answer, but for me, the differences between Italy and Spain, where we have answers already from the Constitutional Court, they show that there is maybe not so much communication, informal communication between the regions and the central level. That's at least what I observe in Spain and in Austria. We see that besides of what I had been presenting with the complicated distribution of competences, and I think distribution of competences is in practice is always complicated because at some point, some decision has to be taken. So we see in Austria that there is much going on an informal level. And maybe that's sometimes easier then because we don't have court decisions which are then carved in stone somehow. What is the aim, or what do I think is the aim of sharing systems and talking about distribution of competences? I think in a federal or in a regional state, we have to talk about the distribution of competences. And since we are facing a problem that is much bigger than we had ever before, we need to find new solutions, and we need to think about who should do what. And I think finally it's about making choices available for the individual citizen. Manuela has mentioned that we also need privates in, but also to make choices available for the local level and also for the regional level. So I think that is the aim. I'm not sure we will have answers, but what I think is that we need systematization of the matter. I also think it makes sense to distinguish between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, and to break it down, as Moritz has said, and to think about what can be done on which level. We have to start somewhere, and it might be different in different states according to different traditions.
Thanks, Maria. Well, my answer would be to your question, which is the million-dollar question: follow the drivers. I think what we have learned today, I mean, listening to the presentation, is that in 5 different countries in the same continent, which is, by the way, bound by the European Union since forever, we have kind of 5 different drivers of climate action, right? I mean, in Germany, we have federal government with all the problems that come with it, and of course, municipalities. In Belgium, I can tell you, I don't see so much action at the local level. I see more prominent action at the regional level, although, of course, with all the problems that come with it. You have, of course, uptake of certain projects, but for the long shot kind of action, local level is not enough. But then I see that Spain, of course, you have the communities which are pushing for several reasons. And the same goes in Italy. I mean, Italy is kind of up for, abiding by their targets for renewable energy. So it's not all bad, you know. I mean, my states are delivering in a way. And Austria as well. I mean, I see that, of course, the fragmentation there is a problem, but also at the land level, you can have some concrete action, perhaps. Just wondering. But I see that actually this fragmentation is something we should build upon. Look at who is driving climate action, and you channel climate policy towards those actors. You cannot come with a one-stop shop solution for that, at least not in the European Union, right? I think you have to look at who is driving climate action locally, regionally, federally, depending on the circumstances of the state. And I think this is the main advantage of having such a workshop right here. So I think this is the general input I would give to you. Just as a footnote, I was involved in a workshop related to the potential adoption of a climate bill in Poland. Big deal, right? I mean, Poland, not so much climate friendly. A lot of discussion going on, you know. So the question was, do we really need a climate law in Poland? And after like 1 day of debates, the answer was, well, kind of no, maybe. I mean, we have so much going on at the local level. Do we really need an adoption of a climate law just because other countries are doing that, where we have a federal government or a central government that is kind of opposing that? So just think about that. There is no one-stop shop solution to that. And I think the answer is follow who is very much pushing for that. Because citizenship is pushing for that. This is happening in Belgium, definitely. You see the push by civil society for more action. But where this action takes place, I think there is no neat answer to that. I mean, this is my general answer. So there's no like super black picture ahead, I think.
May I just
if I may,
sorry.
Following that this idea of follow the front runners, I think that there is another question that should be to be underlined in the following terms. As I think that Moritz and Maria have put on the table, this is a Querschnittfrage, so a transversal question, and we can see climate change as a traditional competence in terms of a traditional constitution. And this is a very deep challenge because, in fact, we are used to have very clear borders between the different subjects in a constitution where there is some kind of distribution of powers. But I think that climate change just is challenging this. It is, for me, this is the reason why cooperation, formal and informal, and civil society involvement, the role of the courts and so on are so important, because we are thinking in terms of pyramid and clear borders, and we are in a world of networking and a little bit ambiguity in terms of how public policies should be designed. This is, in fact, the goal of this workshop, to underline how difficult it is to put climate change in the terms of traditional federal or regional constitutional law. This is the goal. If we understand how difficult it is, probably we are in the way to find a solution. But if we try to treat climate change as a traditional subject, even including climate change in the list of competences in the Constitution, probably we are being wrong. So let's explore from the experience of these different models, help to move on in the terms of Matteo have underlined. And the drivers or the front runners are not the same. And this is a question of cultural tradition, of institutional structures, of so many things that we should be open to different solutions and to dynamic solutions. It is not only that there is a difference between the Spanish model and the Italian one, but probably it will be a very different solution today than in 10 years. So be open and let's design the tools to this networking and transversal challenge, one could say. Maria Chiara.
Maybe I would like just to add a couple of things, and also that I agree completely with what you just said, which anticipate in a way what I was going to say. So when I described the Italian system, I of course stressed the negative aspects because my message was, if we reason in terms of this strict division of competencies for the Italian system, first of all, the implementation of this system has flaws and gaps, and is not consistent with what is written in the Constitution, first, and then is Yes, a traditional way of thinking, especially for lawyers, dividing everything what is so complicated in a very detailed list of what should be done from this governmental level and what should be done from the other level, missing the point. We are in front, as was already the environmental protection competence, but here we have a huge elephant in the room, which is called climate change, which brings on the table a lot of different competencies. So if we reason in these traditional terms, then we have in Italy an increasing of conflicts because we missed the point. So being positive and also a little bit, let's say, creative in terms of institutional engineering, I would call it, and constitutional reform maybe, but also in Italy would be to really strengthen the places where state and regions can meet and dialogue on climate change, and so have let's say a cooperative approach. So what should be really facilitated in Italy, which is not right now, is the cooperative places for different governmental levels to exchange problems, ideas, solutions, not just funneling everything before the constitutional court because I, the region, want to legislate on this, but then the state prevent me to do so. So this is not something that functions right now when dealing with climate change. So was more, let's say, also a provocative presentation to say it's not working right now, this system, because we have to maybe move not to different catalogs of competencies, which do not solve the problems. We have to move towards intergovernmental cooperation between different levels of government in each state, I guess, not only in Italy.
Matteo, Maria, Moritz.
My second point would be brief and would be follow the money, because I think in order to follow the drivers, so to facilitate the front runners against the laggards, money and funding, public funding, would be crucial. I think this is an input that will come from the Paris Agreement, an input that comes from the EU, the new Recovery and Resilience Facility Plan, or whatever you call it, Next Generation EU, you name it. The National Energy and Climate Plans, they all also are about channeling public funding towards certain kind of industries, towards certain kind of technologies. And this is going to happen regardless of the political will of some instances in some countries. So regardless of the new Italian government, whether it will be far-right or not, regardless of whether the Flemish government will, protect certain interests, it happens everywhere in Europe. But I think in the medium to long term, the money would go to certain interest groups. And therefore, at some point, even the laggards will just realize, look, we have to do something about it. I'm quite cynical here, but I think this is one of the most practical way in which a federal government or a central government or regional government, whoever is in charge of it, could actually steer the actual trend. I think this is a rather effective way. I mean, your pocket is your pocket. If your pocket is empty, you start, bothering you. You start being bothered, So I'm putting it very simply, perhaps, but I think this is also a trend that must not be overlooked. We're talking about how to craft governance and how governance is evolving, I think. So this will be my second point.
Maria.
I just want to add something to the Querschnittsmaterie because, it's because it's also German and it sounds horrible, but I think in fact it's not that horrible because Querschnittsmaterie is a traditional term we already live with, and it also is kind of maybe a bit of a safe space, because if we would have many decisions of the Constitutional Court, I think it sometimes makes things more difficult, because then we have a decision and it's very, if it's not favorable, it's very hard to get ways away from that. And we have such a decision in Austria, and it's it's kind of a stone around our necks. So I'm not, or in Austria there is no discussion about having a detailed list of competencies or distribution of competencies. I think this Querschnittmaterie is somehow a bit of a vague space also, where the different levels of government have to take into consideration what the federal level has done. Because what I would be very much interested in the Spanish case, where we have this very dynamic, and I mean, I've seen the climate law of Andalusia, and I was surprised what I could find there. So my question is, what will the Constitutional Court do when, for example, and Moritz has made that point, when private property is at stake, will the Constitutional Court protect or be rather protective of fundamental rights? Because it seems so difficult, and I think the example of Moritz for me is really, what to do. Can we force a house owner or an investment company to make green roofs? How far can we go there?
Thank you, Maria. Moritz, then Volker, and Manuela, if you want to say something about property rights and autonomous communities in Spain.
Slightly object to let's say the conclusion that we should not anymore follow, let's say, the traditional model of clear-cut thematic competences, and rather switch to a model of let's say loose networking and communication between the levels. I think this is a conclusion I often or sometimes read in the federal literature, and maybe marked by the term of cooperative federalism, which is often advocated as such a more or less more innovative, more flexible approach. As a German, at least, I'm skeptical. I would try to to stay with clear-cut competences. I think it is needed. At least it works well in Germany, and I think the actors need to know about their responsibilities actually. And what they're expected to do. Otherwise, I think you will see a trend of organized, let's say, disresponsibilities, a phenomenon which we can study at universities sometimes, but also in other organizations. If it's about burden sharing, responsibilities to actually spend money, to carry burden, heavy burden also in terms, then I think you need clear responsibilities. It won't work without it. That doesn't mean that we don't also need communication. And I think, at least as you told it, I'm not familiar with the Italian system. This is missing actually. And in Germany, of course, there is institutional settings that are guarantee and provide this communication. There is a Länder chamber at the federal level where the regional interests are represented institutionally, and also kind of included in the lawmaking machine. And I think this, of course, you need this intensive communication between the levels and institutional mechanisms that provide for that. But I think we should not easily conclude that we should abstain from, let's say, clear-cut competence. Of course, we always have to look at whether the traditional shape of these competences is still fits the challenges of the future of our time. This might not be the case. And of course, there's always some effort also in Germany to adapt it also by constitutional court decisions to the needs. And sometimes the constitutional legislator has to step in and, let's say, align these competences with the challenges. But I don't know. But maybe it's also a misunderstanding. I mean, would you advocate for, let's say, such a loose system where you don't have clear-cut responsibilities, thematic responsibilities, perhaps?
No, I was not, let's say, proposing to erase the allocation of competencies because all our systems are based on a broader or a more restricted list of competencies. But these, so what I wanted to, let's say, I wanted to focus the attention on another aspect. It's not the division, the perfect division of competencies that is going to solve this problem of climate change governance, because even if we reshape and reallocate the competencies at different governmental levels, we will encounter problems. So what is the difference in this, let's say, traditional approach? What makes the difference in this traditional approach is really the quality of cooperation between the governmental levels. If there is a cooperation, a real cooperation, and is facilitated also by the Constitutional Court doctrines and also by the proper places where the state and regions can dialogue and cooperate, then we have, let's say, an improvement of the system. If we are thinking just to reform the allocation of competencies in traditional terms, we miss the objectives. So what I was suggesting in the case of Italy, and also maybe this applies to other countries, is really to focus more on the cooperation quality between different governmental levels, so that it doesn't happen like it happens in Italy, that the regions are really prevented to legislate. Maybe sometimes they are not apt or able to legislate in a proper way in some sectors. So I'm not saying that that some national levels is better than the federal or the state level to legislate. No, this is not something I was saying. I'm just saying that they have to bring their own also different perspectives, because, for example, what climate change shows is that adaptation and mitigation are two sides of the coin, but some actions can be implemented better at local level. Some other actions should be implemented at national or federal level. This means that all these governmental players have an important role in fighting climate change, but they should cooperate for real, not just fighting to have the competence or to legislate or to administrate.
Understood the problem of the sharing of responsibilities. I think that if you have to choose between clear-cutting and loosening, it's better loosening for at least two reasons. One of them is that if you are so attached to clear-cutting competences, probably you difficult innovation, and innovation is necessary, not only in terms of technical innovation. I think that we should to be accustomed to talk of legal innovation as well. And secondly, I think that we should always have the thought that it's not only a matter of institutions, but also of civil society. And if you want to get involved civil society in climate change policies in a substantial way, probably you have to lose this clear-cutting competence distribution between institutional actors. I think that there is the risk to face responsibilities, and responsibilities are very important, mostly in terms of adaptation. But because someone should to pay the bill, as Matteo have said. But I think that if you obtain clarity paying the price of difficulty in innovation and excluding civil society, is a very high price to pay. So probably we cannot escape of some kind of definition of competences, but probably we should interpret this in a loose terms. And I think that this is also an option for a dynamic approach, which I think that it will be always necessary. Matteo, because Volker have something to say. ¿Quién?
Thank you. Just to remind, there was also a hand raised here.
Yeah.
Traditionally, there are three main instrument groups. We have the sermons, which means information, where we can change behavior. We have the economic instruments to change behavior, and we have the law. And the government has all those three instruments available. It can give money for information campaigns, can do economic incentives, and can involve the law. And when it comes to money, we do not only need to see giving money, but taking money away from people. Yeah. So also this, and that falls for me already under law, yeah, because it doesn't give really economic carrot, but it takes away something, yeah. And that's why I think we should not go totally away from the polluter pays principle, and shift to the provider gets principle. Polluter pays means it's forbidden to do something, yeah, and you are sanctioned. You're sanctioned if you do something also. So, or you have to pay if you want to do this continuously, but rather to say it's not allowed, yeah. And so we don't have to go perhaps into this trap of economics where we think everything can be solved with economics. We can also apply as a state the law, and I don't care who prohibits, for example, certain emissions. If it's 9 provinces of a federal level, or if it's the federal level itself, it just needs to work, and that's why I like this issue of cooperation. Yeah, so it's really the effectiveness and what works, what could work, what could be really those approaches that work, and that's my point. Shall I give to the lady, because she was actually raising the hand before me?
Okay. I'd like to add an aspect concerning coordination. Maybe if clear cutting distribution of competences isn't possible because of different reasons, why not establish a coordinating mechanism by law as plan B, perhaps?
A quick one. The example of Belgium will tell you, Belgium has kind of dozens of cooperation mechanisms established by law. They led nowhere, okay, as far as climate change is concerned. So I'm a very bad example of that, about, codifying this kind of, I didn't have time to go through all of them, but, that's where the things get very marvelous. So I will be happy to share something with you on that. Yeah, at least as far as Belgium is concerned, this is not necessarily an option, but might be an option somewhere else. But I know there are questions there.
Hi. First, thank you all for your presentations. My name is Fernando. I'm from Brazil, and I'm currently studying at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And I must say that I was a bit surprised with all the, if I can say, the black holes in the legislations, because, okay, let's just put aside the current Brazilian situation with Bolsonaro, which I'm definitely not his supporter. He's terrible for the environment. But the Brazilian legislation in the federation model is very good. Actually, is inspired in the American model. So I worked at the courthouse in Brazil, and from article, for example, 21 to 24 of the Brazilian Federal Constitution, it's very clear the distribution between the union, the states, the municipalities. They all have competence to legislate, to administrative competences. So the union, for example, can set some general rules, and all the other members can put more strict rules to protect the environment. If it protects less the environment, it's very solid in the Brazilian Supreme Court that this law will be unconstitutional. Therefore, what came to my mind is that, yeah, especially after Bolsonaro, which is perverting the environment with executive orders, not with laws, you have some, the EU is putting some censorship against the Brazilian government, but then isn't this a bit contradictory? Because, and being very honest, I really don't like his government, but comparing the Brazilian constitution, all the laws, Brazil has 26 states, almost 6,000 cities, and I can't remember any issue with some environmental damage with distribution of competence. It was very clear with the rivers, with the mountains, even in the Amazon. So I was very intrigued about this could give argument for people like him, for example, to say, yeah, how could you say that? But at least we have a good legislation. And even more, as I said, I was surprised because I remember my professor at the university explaining, oh, this was inspired by the German constitution, by the cooperative federalism. So this is my question. I would like to hear from you.
We are getting late. Only three interventions more. So one, Manuela and Moritz. Yeah.
Thank you. So my name is Francesca Leucci, and I am a PhD student at Bologna and Rotterdam and Hamburg universities. So I would like to bring an additional issue in the debate, because we are talking about climate change, but we never mentioned biodiversity. And I mean, climate change is not just about carbon pollution, which is also just one part of the pollution, because we also have nitrogen pollution and other forms of pollution. But climate change also causes biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss further causes climate change. So there is this important issue, and I'm surprised that we didn't mention it during the debate on competencies on climate change. So I was wondering why. So probably is again the effect of this fragmented way of looking at environmental laws. And secondly, if we bring biodiversity in the spotlight and in the climate change debate, I wonder what is the competence there which is the most appropriate to tackle biodiversity, and especially the possible clash between energy and biodiversity, because we all know that if we practice more, if we allow more renewable projects, then we are going to harm biodiversity. But the problem there is that biodiversity is just about protected areas, and this is the vision that environmental lawyers have, but biodiversity is not just within protected areas, it's also outside. And we lack data outside the protected areas. So, I mean, normally biodiversity is also something that is the value of biodiversity is not just at the national level, but it's at the local level. So it's something very, very close to the people. And so there is a recent Italian law which is actually allowing to accelerate the projects of renewable energies, which means to skip on this intergovernmental cooperation. This is the reality. So what are we talking about? This is what is happening. So where is the collaboration? The collaboration is completely against the speed of this climate change policy, the normal trend. So I wonder, if we have to bring biodiversity in this debate, what should be the level of competence which is the most appropriate, and how to solve this puzzle, so this possible clash between normal climate change policies which address just carbon pollution and the protection of biodiversity. Thank you.
Manuela Moritz und that That's all. Manuela? Moritz?
So there's a lot of questions. First of all, about private property, but you are the specialist, not me. So, which is the attitude of the Constitutional Court? I think about private property is a very solid line of jurisprudence. But I was thinking about the Navarre law, and for instance, the opportunity of declare some soil as reserve for energy renewable energy, so it's a sort of mechanism to control, to limit private property. So it can be a conflict, or it can be because I remember also autonomous regional laws about renewable energy, like the Andalusian one, and this law also declares that the public utility of some project, which is a sort of protection and a limit for private property. On the other hand, about how do we manage with the competencies, about the Brazilian model and so on. I don't think it's like Jordi said before. It's not a matter of how to rewrite the competencies at the constitutional level. It's how to implement the model, how to understand the climate change policy. It includes biodiversity, it includes renewable energy, because it's mitigation and adaptation policy. So you have the chance to take measures about biodiversity, but you have to find out the starting point, the meeting point between the needs of energy, renewable energies, and to protect the environment. But this is not a new debate. It's a very old debate. I remember the Galician law about renewable energies about, I don't know, about 2000, I don't remember, and it was very interesting because it was trying to protect the biodiversity, and the law was trying also to promote renewable energy projects. So it should be a meeting point with the instrument like the environmental management. I don't remember the word. Evaluación de impacto ambiental, que no me sale.
Environmental impact assessment.
Environmental impact assessment. So we can try to manage with the two problems, because they are all of them are climate change problems. That they are mitigation problems and adaptation problems. And the only thing that I want to add is the last thing is climate change have a territorial component that we can miss. We can't miss at all. So climate change law needs flexible solutions and territorial solutions, which is also said by Jordi before.
Well, thank you, Manuel. I think that was a wonderful conclusion for the day, and I think there's still many questions out there, remaining questions. For me, also a question which I don't want to raise now because it's late, is also how to break down, let's say, the top-down approach of the European Union with the climate targets across levels and sectors. I think this is still not solved in any country. In Germany, as I said, we're trying to break it down to sectors, but then how to break sectors down to levels? There's no solution to that so far. But it's an important approach that we took in Europe, not only in Europe, in Paris. And we got to find some ways to break down these targets even to communities. And it'd be interesting to also to do some research on that, how it's done in the States. Altogether, I think we're dealing with a vast research field, and I hope we find some way to follow up on these questions. I see many people in the room who could do so with workshops or journal articles. I'm looking forward to the journal. and to further opportunities to discuss the matter. And I think with this, I will give back to
Thank you very much for your insights. It is a very complex question, and articles are welcome, and we will try to make some kind of follow-up, because we just start to define the problems. So we move to the concluding remarks by Maria Chiara and Andrews, to summing up to some extent the conclusions of the workshop.
Well, I guess that most of the conclusions were already anticipated by also this round of this final round of Q&A. But in any case, if I have to conclude, I would recall the following aspects. First, that the current allocation of competencies in all decentralized countries reveals flaws and gaps with the rising of climate change problems. Because climate change is simply so complex and urgent matter that impinges on existing multi-level structures and calls for profound reforms, if not constitutional reforms, at least profound rethinking of intergovernmental relations in all states. And then what can be observed in all these decentralized countries is that, okay, they reveal flaws and gaps, but for example, some decentralized countries are better than others because they show a more cooperative attitude, maybe in dealing with climate change. And so the different levels have different responsibilities, but also the possibility to engage into the climate change governance for real. And then another aspect that was mentioned by not only by us, but also by the audience, is the role that the EU is playing in not only in climate change governance, but also in some trends of re-centralizing and decentralizing climate change policies. So what is maybe an additional aspect that we should let's say focus on is the role that the EU plays with regard to regional local levels, because sometimes during the past years the European Union tried to really link the European policy, climate change policies, to the local level in order to emphasize and to have a support from the local basis, which could not maybe reach at the national level. So it was also a way the European Union found to increase the role played at local level, having maybe some a position of member states which was not going in the same direction. So building So increasing the role of the local level could be maybe a good way to reinforce also the actions toward adaptation in all the member states. And in particular, I'm also thinking the role is playing the European Union with regard to energy transition, because it further pushes states toward processes of decentralization and even to experiences of participatory democracy. So I will leave this point to Andrews. And so
thank you, Maricara. And yes, I thought about the point of energy transition, but before that, since Francesca put into our attention the question of biodiversity, I thought about the biggest elephant in the room, which is the word that does not appear this afternoon, which is Anthropocene. So the question is, it's not an ideal rhetorical trope. I think it's a real problem. So the question is that Anthropocene challenge our legal categories as competencies or property and so on and so on. Therefore, the question is, are our legal orders compatible with the Earth system condition? And Earth system is de facto source of law. And we have to try technical solution to accommodate that. Not easy at all. Then, I think that is an important point. I think that with this point, we touch the bone, the sense, if you want, of the Congress that we start tomorrow. Our idea is complexity, interconnection, and therefore taking into account the real interconnection of the fields that are central for our concerns. And finishing with this conclusion, I was thinking about the point of the energy regulatory framework. As my colleague Maria Chiara has just said, we know perfectly well that the climate energy binomial is out of question in the European framework. However, when we move to the national level, we can find situations in which the climate issue is assigned to the environmental competence, which may be different from the energy competence of each national constitutional framework. For example, in Italy, the environmental competence is reserved to states, but energy is concurrent between states and regions. While in Spain, it is almost other way, given that the state has exclusive competency in the field of energy law, while in environmental matters, the autonomous communities can approve additional protection legislation. Moreover, it could be energy as a matter is more prone to be constitutionally declined according to the centralizing competences in the economic field. Finally, constitutions, the Spanish case is a clear example of that, are normative and epistemic frameworks that respond to the model that Timothy Mitchell called fossil democracy. That is to say, the energy issue was constitutionally embedded as a question of large generating facility based on fossil fuel and nuclear energy plants. So the Spanish Constitutional Court is still anchored to this fossil perspective in its jurisprudence. This is well known for us. This fossil lock-in restricts the perspective of updating constitutional competence and their control. This has nothing to do with the energy transition that aims at decentralized models, at the empowerment of community resilience, for example, through the implementation of energy communities, which do not only involve regional dimension, but also the different level at the local governments and even district level according to the most recent European policy. In conclusion, it is up to the speakers of today's excellent workshop to elaborate their contribution in the form of articles that will be published in the special issue of the journal. But I would like to propose to the Institute and Dr. Aria, that represent the Institute right now, that this workshop should have a second edition in which we can precisely address the other problem of the energy law dimension, without which no climate policy will be possible. So thank you very much for your participation. And I think that we can officially close the workshop. We can therefore